This seat isn't for people like you. Captain William Foster's words cut through the hushed atmosphere of first class like a knife, causing several passengers to look up from their tablets and magazines. The morning sun streamed through the oval windows of Skyway Airways Flight 227, illuminating the tension now hanging in the air. The girl he addressed didn't flinch. Zoe Jackson, 13 years old, sat perfectly still in seat 2A, her dark eyes meeting the captain's gaze with quiet confidence. She wore a tailored burgundy blazer over a crisp white blouse, pearl earrings catching the light as she tilted her head slightly. "My ticket says otherwise, Captain," she replied, her voice steady and clear. Foster's eyes narrowed, the corners of his mouth tightening into what might have been a smile on anyone else. On him, it looked like a warning. His uniform was immaculate. Every button polished, every crease perfect, the wings on his chest gleaming with authority that he wielded like a weapon. "There must be a mistake," he said, voice dropping to a stage whisper that somehow carried across the first-class cabin. "First class is reserved for business travelers and our premium guests." A businessman across the aisle glanced up, brow furrowed. An elderly woman 2 rows back removed her reading glasses. A couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. Zoe placed her tablet on the side table, revealing a complex spreadsheet of quarterly financial projections. "I assure you, Captain, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Foster's face darkened. In 23 years of flying, he had never been challenged by a child, especially not a black child who looked like she belonged in economy with a school group not in his first-class cabin among executives and celebrities. "We'll see about that," he muttered, turning sharply toward the galley where flight attendant Jennifer Collins was preparing welcome drinks. Zoe watched him go, then took a measured breath, her hand unconsciously touching the pearl earring on her left ear, her mother's pearls. The weight of them against her skin was comforting, familiar, like her mother's hand on her shoulder saying, "Remember who you are." Outside the aircraft windows, JFK International Airport buzzed with morning activity. Maintenance crews, baggage handlers, and ground staff moved in choreographed precision. Inside the first-class cabin, something else was taking shape. A confrontation that would change an airline forever. 6 years earlier, Zoe sat cross-legged on her parents' bedroom floor watching her mother prepare for a conference. Dr. Jasmine Jackson stood before the mirror, elegant fingers fastening pearl earrings to her ears. "Why do you always wear those same earrings?" Mom Zoe asked, chin propped on her small hands. Jasmine smiled at her daughter in the reflection. "Because they remind me who I am when people try to make me forget." "Who tries to make you forget?" Jasmine turned her surgical scrubs contrasting with the pearls. "The world sometimes has a narrow view of who belongs where, Zoe. These pearls belonged to my grandmother, who cleaned houses for wealthy families. She saved for years to buy them, even though she could never wear them to work." Young Zoe frowned, processing this. "That's not fair." No, it wasn't. But whenever I walk into an operating room and someone mistakes me for a nurse instead of the chief surgeon, these pearls remind me that I belong there, that I earned my place. Present day, Zoe touched the same pearls now as the cabin crew continued their pre-flight preparations. After her mother died in a car accident 3 years ago, her father had given her the earrings. "For when you need to remember," he'd said. Her father, Thomas Jackson, had built Skyway Airways from nothing, a single leased plane and a dream that grew into a billion-dollar international airline. He'd made sure Zoe understood the business from the ground up. While other children visited amusement parks, Zoe toured maintenance hangars. While they played video games, she studied flight manifests and load factors. "The numbers tell stories if you listen closely enough," Thomas always said. At age 10, Zoe attended her first board meeting sitting quietly in the corner. Afterward, Thomas asked her, "What did you notice?" The man in the blue tie kept checking his watch whenever Ms. Rodriguez was speaking. Zoe had replied, "And I think the financial projections for next quarter are too optimistic." Thomas had laughed with surprise and pride. "Why do you think that?" "Because you're assuming fuel prices will stay low, but the conflict in the Middle East is getting worse." Within months, fuel prices had spiked, proving Zoe right. From then on, Thomas took her observations seriously. Last night, Zoe had found her father clutching his chest and his study face, pale with pain. The doctors called it a minor heart attack. A warning, they'd said. Not life-threatening, but he needed rest. The London shareholder meeting couldn't be postponed. The Q3 results were critical, showing the airline's first full year of growth since the pandemic. "I need you to go in my place," Thomas had said from his hospital bed. "Dad, I'm 13. They won't listen to me." Thomas had smiled, tired but determined. "They'll have no choice. You know the numbers better than most of my executives. And you're a Jackson. Act like it." Now, as Captain Foster conferred with Jennifer Collins in hushed tones, casting suspicious glances her way, Zoe opened her tablet again. The presentation she would deliver tomorrow to some of the wealthiest investors in the aviation industry was displayed on the screen. She'd rehearsed it 15 times. She knew every number, every projection, every risk factor. What she hadn't prepared for was proving her right to sit in seat 2A. William Foster had been born into the right family, attended the right schools, and joined the right clubs. His father, a retired airline executive, had made the necessary calls when William expressed interest in becoming a pilot. While other cadets struggled through flight school on loans and part-time jobs, Foster sailed through on family connections and an unshakable belief in his natural superiority. 23 years at Skyway Airways had only reinforced this belief. He'd started as first officer during the airline's early expansion, back when Thomas Jackson was still flying routes himself. Foster had expected to rise quickly through the ranks, not just to captain but to the executive suite. That trajectory had been derailed 5 years ago when Jackson passed him over for Chief of Flight Operations, choosing James Wilson instead, a decision Foster attributed to diversity hiring rather than Wilson's superior qualifications and leadership skills. "It's the way things are going now," he'd complained to his golf buddy Andrew Wilson, a middle manager in HR. "Qualifications don't matter anymore. It's all about checking boxes." Andrew had nodded sympathetically and helped bury the complaint Wilson filed about Foster's hostile comments in the cockpit. This wasn't an isolated incident. Over the years, Foster had developed a reputation among certain crew members and passengers, particularly those of color. There was nothing overt, nothing that could be definitively proven. Just a pattern of random extra screenings for minority first-class passengers when he was captain. Just a tendency to question the credentials of non-white professionals more thoroughly. Just a habit of being slightly less responsive to service requests from certain passengers. Foster's prejudice had roots in his upbringing. His father, Gerald Foster, had been forced to retire early when airlines began diversifying their executive ranks in the 1990s. At home, the elder Foster would rail against quotas and unqualified diversity hires, planting seeds that grew into William's worldview. During family dinners, Gerald would point to news stories about the changing aviation industry that should have been your job, he'd tell William whenever a minority candidate received a promotion. These formative experiences left Foster with a deep-seated belief that certain people belonged in certain places and others didn't. He viewed himself as a guardian of standards, maintaining what he saw as the proper order of the cabin. Now in the galley of Flight 227, Foster leaned close to Jennifer Collins. "That girl in 2A, he said quietly. "How old is she?" Jennifer glanced over his shoulder. 13, according to the manifest. She's an unaccompanied minor in first class. 13, Foster repeated as if the number itself was suspicious. "And how exactly does a 13-year-old end up in first class by herself?" Jennifer arranged champagne flutes on her tray, uncomfortable with his tone. "Her ticket is fully paid." "Captain, everything's in order?" Foster's jaw tightened. "Nothing about this is in order. Who paid for it? Who authorized an unaccompanied minor in first? I'm not sure that's—" "Look at her," Foster interrupted. "Doesn't this seem off to you? First-class tickets cost thousands. That seat could be filled by a real business traveler." Jennifer kept her expression neutral. 6 months into her job at Skyway, she'd learned to navigate these situations carefully. Speaking up meant risking her position. Staying silent meant compromising her integrity. Neither option felt right. "I'll double-check the manifest," she said, finally, a small concession that bought her time without committing to Foster's unspoken suggestion. Foster straightened his uniform jacket. "Do that, and notify me immediately if you find any discrepancies." As he turned to continue his pre-flight inspection, Foster's gaze caught on a commotion at the gate visible through the aircraft door. A blonde woman was gesticulating wildly at the gate agent, her voice carrying down the jet bridge. Foster recognized Victoria Palmer immediately, wife of Richard Palmer, CEO of Palmer Investments. The Palmers were Skyway Airways elite members who frequently booked premium cabins. They also contributed generously to the same exclusive country club where Foster played golf every Sunday. Victoria's voice grew louder as she approached the aircraft door. "This is absolutely unacceptable. I fly with Skyway constantly." Foster moved toward the door, seeing an opportunity. Victoria Palmer deserved to be in first class. That girl did not. The solution seemed obvious. Thomas Jackson had not set out to build an airline empire. 20 years ago, he'd been a commercial pilot with a dream of creating something different. An airline where excellence wasn't determined by the passenger's pedigree but by the service provided. Starting with a single leased Boeing 737 and routes nobody wanted, Skyway Airways grew steadily under his leadership. Thomas hired based on talent rather than connections, promoted based on performance rather than politics, and built a reputation for reliability that attracted business travelers and tourists alike. "An airline is like a small society in the sky," he often told new employees. "How we treat each other and our passengers reflects who we are as a company." This philosophy had guided Skyway's growth from regional carrier to international player, with over 200 aircraft and routes spanning 5 continents. Thomas's vision had created not just an airline, but a culture. When Thomas stepped back from day-to-day operations 3 years ago after his wife's death, Alexander Morales took over as CEO. Morales had been with Skyway almost from the beginning, rising from operations manager to Thomas's right-hand man through intelligence, hard work, and unwavering integrity. "Never forget what makes us different," Thomas had told him during the transition. "We don't just move people from place to place. We show them what respect looks like at 35,000 feet. Morales had maintained Thomas's vision as best he could, but like any large organization, Skyway developed subcultures beyond his direct control. Pockets of resistance formed against policies perceived as too soft or too political. Some veteran employees, particularly those who had joined through traditional aviation networks, created their own power structures within the company. These unofficial power networks operated through social connections, the golf club alumni associations, and even family ties. They formed an invisible hierarchy that often bypassed official reporting channels. Foster's alliance with Andrew Wilson in HR was just one strand in this web of relationships that quietly subverted Thomas Jackson's vision. Meanwhile, newer employees hired for their alignment with the company's stated values often found themselves marginalized by these established networks. Many either assimilated into the shadow culture or left the company frustrated by the disconnect between Skyway's public image and its internal reality. In the last quarterly report, the one Zoe would present tomorrow, a troubling pattern had emerged. While overall customer satisfaction remained high, scores among minority passengers in premium cabins had declined by 7% over the previous year. The data point was buried in Appendix C, easy to overlook unless you were searching for it. Zoe had spotted it immediately. "Dad, something's wrong here," she'd said, highlighting the section on her tablet. Thomas had studied it, brow furrowed. "Could be coincidence." 7% isn't coincidence, Zoe had replied. "That's a pattern." Now, as Zoe sat in seat 2A reviewing the presentation one last time, she wondered if this moment, this confrontation with Captain Foster, was connected to those numbers. If her personal experience was part of a larger pattern that the data had been trying to reveal. The shareholder meeting wasn't just about financial projections and expansion plans anymore. It was about the soul of the company her father had built, about whether Skyway Airways would continue to reflect his vision or become something else entirely. Something that questioned whether a 13-year-old black girl belonged in first class simply because of how she looked. "I need to speak to the captain immediately." Victoria Palmer's voice carried from the jet bridge into the aircraft. "This is completely unacceptable." Paula Rivera, the gate agent handling the boarding process for Flight 227, maintained her professional smile despite the verbal onslaught she'd been enduring for the past 10 minutes. "Mrs. Palmer, I understand your frustration, but first class is completely booked for this flight. There are simply no seats available." "Then make one available." Victoria snapped designer handbag, swinging wildly as she gestured. "Do you know how much my husband's company spends with Skyway annually? Millions. I refuse to sit in economy like some college student on spring break." Victoria Palmer came from old money and had married into even more wealth. Her sense of entitlement wasn't just about comfort. It was about maintaining the social hierarchy she believed in. To her, a seat in economy was an insult to her status, a denial of the deference she felt she deserved. In her mind, rules were flexible things that existed primarily for other people. Paula had been with Skyway for 12 years. She'd seen this type of entitlement before and knew there was little she could do to diffuse it. "I'm happy to add you to the upgrade list in case there's a last-minute cancellation." "The upgrade list?" Victoria's voice rose higher. "I'm not waiting for someone's charity. Get me Captain Foster. We belong to the same club. He'll sort this out." Paula hesitated, then reached for her radio. Protocol discouraged disturbing the flight crew during preparations, but sometimes appeasing a high-status passenger was the path of least resistance, Captain, Mrs. "Victoria Palmer is requesting to speak with you at the gate. She's insistent about needing a first-class seat." Foster's voice came through immediately. "Tell her I'll be right there." In the cockpit, First Officer Diego Hernandez looked up from the pre-flight checklist as Foster unbuckled his harness. "Everything okay?" Captain, Diego asked, noting the unusual interruption to their routine. "Just a VIP situation at the gate," Foster replied dismissively. "Continue with the exterior lighting check." Diego nodded, returning to the checklist. At 32, he was one of Skyway's younger first officers with a spotless record and reputation for meticulous attention to detail. In 6 months of flying with Foster, he'd learned to recognize the warning signs of the captain's moods. Something in Foster's tone now, a certain eagerness beneath the professional veneer, made Diego uneasy. As Foster exited the cockpit, Diego caught Jennifer's eye. The flight attendant gave him a subtle head shake that confirmed his suspicion. Whatever was happening wasn't standard procedure. Meanwhile, in first class, passengers continued boarding. A famous actor in sunglasses and baseball cap slipped quietly into 4B, avoiding eye contact. An elderly couple settled into 3C and 3D, arranging travel pillows and discussing their London itinerary. A tech entrepreneur in jeans and an expensive sweater took 5A, immediately powering up his laptop despite announcements to keep electronics stowed. Zoe observed them all while reviewing her notes. Her father had taught her to watch people to understand their patterns and behaviors. Aviation is a people business disguised as a transportation business, he always said. Now she watched the subtle hierarchies form. who nodded to whom, who pretended not to notice others who expected deference and who offered it. When James Wilson boarded, the same James Wilson who had been chosen over Foster for the executive position, Zoe recognized him from board meetings. This wasn't coincidence. Wilson was conducting one of his quarterly in-flight service evaluations, a program he had implemented after his promotion. He made a practice of flying various routes unannounced to observe operations firsthand. Today, he had specifically chosen Flight 227, after receiving several concerning reports about the crew's treatment of minority passengers. He nodded politely as he passed, then did a double-take, clearly surprised to see her. Zoe Jackson. Is Thomas here too? No, sir. Just me. Dad had a health issue. I'm representing him at the London meeting. Wilson's eyebrows rose. That's quite a responsibility. Are you ready? Zoe met his gaze directly. I am. Wilson studied her for a moment, then smiled. I believe you are. Your father trained you well. As he continued to his seat, Zoe returned to her presentation, aware that the dynamics around her had shifted. Wilson's recognition had marked her as someone connected to the airline's founder, not just a random teenager in first class. Outside on the jet bridge, Foster was deep in conversation with Victoria Palmer, his body language transforming from rigid captain to solicitous friend. Victoria. What seems to be the problem? Victoria's voice dropped to a conspiratorial tone. William, thank goodness. This is an emergency. Richard's closing a major deal in London tonight. I need to be there looking my best, not crammed in economy like cattle. Foster checked his tablet, scrolling through the passenger manifest. Let me see what I can do. The flight is full, but... His eyes stopped on seat 2A. There might be a solution. Foster returned to the aircraft with Victoria Palmer following closely behind her. Expression shifted from indignation to smug anticipation. As they entered the first-class cabin, Foster's eyes immediately found Zoe still absorbed in her tablet. Jennifer Foster called quietly to the flight attendant preparing welcome drinks. A word, please. Jennifer approached, professional smile in place, but eyes wary. Foster lowered his voice, though not enough to prevent nearby passengers from overhearing. There's been a manifest discrepancy with seat 2A, he said. Mrs. Palmer needs to be accommodated in first class and will need to relocate the minor. Jennifer glanced at Zoe, then back to Foster. Captain, her boarding pass is valid. I've already verified it. It's an error in the system, Foster insisted. Unaccompanied minors shouldn't be in first class without special authorization. It's a safety consideration. Jennifer knew this wasn't true. Skyway had no such policy. Sir, I don't believe. As captain, I have final authority over passenger seating for operational reasons. Foster interrupted, his tone hardening. Please prepare to relocate her to economy. We'll process a refund for the fare difference. Jennifer hesitated, caught in an impossible position. She had been with Skyway for only 6 months. Her student loans from hospitality school totaled over $80,000. Her mother's medical bills had already depleted her savings. She needed this job. But what Foster was asking wasn't just unfair. It felt wrong on a fundamental level. I'll speak with her, Jennifer said finally, buying time rather than committing. As Jennifer approached Zoe's seat, Foster turned to Victoria with a reassuring nod. We'll have you settled in momentarily. Victoria smiled, already removing her designer scarf. I knew you'd take care of it, William. The airline should be grateful to have someone who understands the importance of proper customer service. In the cockpit, Diego had finished the pre-flight checks and was wondering what was delaying Foster's return. He stepped into the forward galley just in time to see Jennifer approaching Zoe while Foster and Victoria watched from nearby. Is everything all right? He asked another flight attendant preparing the service cart. The captain wants to move that young girl to economy to give her seat to Mrs. Palmer, the attendant whispered, clearly uncomfortable. Jennifer's trying to handle it, but Diego frowned. As first officer, his authority was limited, especially when challenging a captain's decisions, but his sense of justice was strong. His own sister had faced similar situations, assumptions based on appearance rather than rights or qualifications. He remained in the galley watching the situation unfold, prepared to intervene if necessary. Jennifer stopped beside Zoe's seat. "Excuse me, miss," she began, her discomfort evident. "There seems to be a question about your seating assignment." Zoe looked up, calm but alert. "What kind of question?" Before Jennifer could respond, Foster stepped forward. "We need to make a seating adjustment due to operational requirements," he said, his authoritative tone suggesting the matter was already decided. "We're going to relocate you to economy class." "Operational requirements?" Zoe repeated the phrase, immediately recognizable as manufactured justification. She'd heard her father discuss how certain terminology was misused to mask questionable decisions. "Yes," Foster continued. "You'll receive a refund for the fare difference and a voucher for future travel." Zoe closed her tablet case deliberately, taking time to gather her thoughts. Around her, the first-class cabin had grown quiet. Passengers were watching now, sensing the unusual confrontation brewing. Victoria Palmer stood just behind Foster, impatience evident in her posture designer handbag already positioned to claim the seat. "I have a confirmed reservation for this seat," Zoe said finally, her voice clear and steady. "I'm not moving." Foster's expression hardened surprise, quickly replaced by irritation. Children, in his experience, followed adult instructions. They didn't challenge authority. "Young lady," he said, lowering his voice to what he probably thought was a reasonable tone, but came across as condescending. "This isn't a request. It's a required adjustment." Several rows back, James Wilson set aside his financial newspaper, watching the exchange with growing concern. The elderly woman in 3A removed her reading glasses. The famous actor in 4B shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to speak up. Zoe looked directly at Foster, then at Victoria Palmer, then back to Foster. "Captain, what specific operational requirement necessitates moving me from my assigned seat?" The directness of the question, the adult vocabulary, the calm delivery, momentarily threw Foster off balance. This wasn't the response he had expected from a 13-year-old. "That's not your concern," he recovered, his tone sharpening. "We're the airline professionals here." Victoria stepped forward with an artificial smile. "Sweetheart, sometimes adults need to make arrangements that you don't understand. First class is really for business travelers. I have an important meeting in London." Zoe turned her gaze to Victoria, her expression unchanged. "I'm not your sweetheart, ma'am. And I also have an important meeting in London." The tension in the cabin thickened. Jennifer stood frozen, her professional training at war with her moral compass. Diego watched from the galley, mentally calculating how much further he could let this go before intervening. Foster leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, though still audible to nearby passengers. "Listen to me carefully. Either you move voluntarily or I'll have you removed from this flight entirely. Is that clear?" Zoe didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her jacket pocket and removed her phone. "Perfectly clear, Captain," she said. "And I'd like to document this conversation. For the record, put that phone away, immediately." Foster's command was sharp and immediate, his hand moving toward Zoe's device. Zoe kept her phone steady, her finger already pressing record. "I'm exercising my right as a passenger to document what I believe is discriminatory treatment, Captain." Foster's face flushed red. In his 23 years of flying, he'd never been openly challenged like this, certainly not by a child, and definitely not with the calm authority this girl displayed. It was unsettling, and his instinct was to reassert control. "This has nothing to do with discrimination," he said, voice tight with restraint. "This is about proper seat assignments and airline protocol." Victoria Palmer stepped closer, her patience visibly wearing thin. "This is ridiculous. I have a dinner to attend in London tonight." "Just move the girl and let's be done with this nonsense." Several first-class passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. James Wilson, the executive who'd greeted Zoe earlier, set his newspaper aside completely, his attention now fully on the confrontation. Captain Jennifer interjected cautiously. "Perhaps we should check with operations before making any seat changes. The manifest shows Miss Jackson's reservation is valid and paid in full." Foster turned to Jennifer, his expression darkening. "I've made my decision. Prepare an economy seat for Miss Jackson." "I'm staying right here," Zoe stated firmly. "My ticket is for seat 2A. I have every legal right to occupy this seat." From the galley, Diego Hernandez had heard enough. As first officer, his position was delicate. Challenging a captain's authority could have serious career repercussions. But what he was witnessing crossed a line from questionable judgment to something much worse. He stepped into the cabin. "Captain, we're falling behind on our departure checklist. Perhaps we should proceed with boarding and address any seating concerns after takeoff." Foster barely acknowledged Diego. "Handle the checklist." "First officer, I'm dealing with a passenger issue. A passenger issue you created," Zoe said, the recording continuing. "You're attempting to remove me from my assigned seat to accommodate Mrs. Palmer, who has an economy ticket. That's not an operational requirement. That's preferential treatment." The accuracy of her assessment hung in the air. Several passengers nodded subtly in agreement. Victoria's artificial composure cracked. "Listen, little girl, you have no idea who you're dealing with. My husband is Richard Palmer, CEO of Palmer Investments." Zoe finished for her. "That doesn't entitle you to my seat." Foster stepped closer to Zoe, lowering his voice in what seemed like an attempt at reasonable negotiation, but came across as menacing. "Young lady, you're delaying an international flight. There are consequences for that. Are there also consequences for discriminatory treatment of passengers?" Captain Foster Zoe asked, her gaze steady. The question hung in the air, direct and unavoidable. Foster's jaw tightened. "This is your final warning. Either you move to economy voluntarily or I'll have security remove you from this aircraft." Jennifer's eyes widened. Removing a properly ticketed passenger, a minor no less, would require documentation, justification, involvement from customer service. The irregularity of Foster's demand was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone in the cabin. "I'll need that instruction in writing," Captain Zoe replied. "Along with your specific justification for removing me despite my valid ticket and reservation." The confidence in her voice didn't waver, but her right hand moved almost imperceptibly to touch her mother's pearl earring, a private gesture of courage that only Jennifer, standing closest to her, noticed. "You don't make demands on my aircraft," Foster said, his control slipping further. "Security will escort you off if necessary." Diego stepped forward again. "Captain, I strongly recommend we consult with operations before taking that step." The tension in the cabin was palpable now. Other passengers were shifting nervously, some taking out their phones, sensing that something unprecedented was unfolding. Victoria Palmer glanced around, suddenly aware that the audience witnessing this confrontation was growing increasingly unsympathetic to her position. She cleared her throat. "William, perhaps there's another solution? Maybe another first-class passenger would be willing to—" "No," Foster cut her off. "This has gone beyond seating now. This is about respect for authority on my aircraft." Zoe's expression remained composed, but her eyes revealed a deep understanding of what was really happening. "Is it about authority, Captain? Or is it about who you believe belongs in first class?" The question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of discomfort through the first-class cabin. Foster's expression hardened as he realized the girl was directly challenging not just his decision, but his motivation, and doing it in front of an audience. "This is not about race," he stated flatly, the defensiveness in his tone betraying him. "I never mentioned race." Captain Zoe replied, the observation hanging in the air between them. Jennifer Collins glanced anxiously between them, caught in the uncomfortable middle. 6 months into her dream job, she found herself facing a moral crossroads she hadn't anticipated. Foster was her superior, but every instinct told her his actions were wrong. "Captain," she said quietly, "company policy requires documentation for any involuntary passenger removal." "We need to involve customer service, and I know the policy," Foster snapped. "And as captain, I have final authority over safety and operational decisions on this aircraft." "What safety concern does a 13-year-old girl in first class present?" James Wilson spoke up from his seat, his deep voice carrying authority that came from his executive position. "I'd be very interested to hear the explanation." Foster turned clearly surprised by Wilson's intervention. The history between them, Foster being passed over for the promotion Wilson received, added another layer of tension to the moment. "This doesn't concern you, Mr. Wilson," Foster replied, struggling to maintain his professional demeanor. "I believe it concerns everyone on this flight," Wilson countered, "especially those of us who care about how Skyway Airways conducts itself." Victoria Palmer, sensing her position weakening, tried a different approach. She leaned toward Zoe with a condescending smile. "Darling, I understand you're excited about sitting in first class, but I have an important business dinner that requires me to be presentable when we land. Surely you can understand adult responsibilities." Zoe met her gaze steadily. "I'm not your darling, ma'am, and I also have an important meeting in London." Victoria's smile faltered. "Shareholder meeting. What company would include a child in Skyway Airways?" Zoe replied simply. The revelation sent a subtle but perceptible shift through the cabin. Passengers who had been watching with uncomfortable interest now exchanged glances of surprise. Foster's expression flickered. Confusion, then disbelief, then the first hint of uncertainty. "You're claiming to be a Skyway Airways shareholder?" he asked, skepticism evident in his tone. "I'm not claiming anything," Zoe replied. "I'm stating a fact. My name is Zoe Jackson." The significance of her last name didn't register immediately with everyone, but James Wilson's quiet "oh" spoke volumes. He knew exactly who she was. Foster, however, wasn't ready to back down. "I don't care if your last name is Jackson, Kennedy, or Rockefeller. On this aircraft, you follow the captain's instructions." Diego moved closer, his concern growing by the second. "Captain, a word in private, please." Foster ignored him, focusing entirely on Zoe. "This is your final opportunity. Move to economy willingly or face removal from this flight." Jennifer stepped forward, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "Captain Foster, I need to document your reasoning for this decision. It's required by company protocol. The reason is insubordination." Foster stated loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "This passenger is disrupting pre-flight procedures." By sitting in my assigned seat, Zoe asked her recording still active, or by refusing to give it up to Mrs. Palmer. The elderly woman in 3A finally spoke up, her British accent crisp and authoritative. "I've been flying with Skyway for 30 years, young man, and I've never witnessed such behavior from a captain. This child has done nothing wrong." Victoria Palmer, seeing her allies dwindling, tried one last angle. "This is about proper procedure, not personalities. The captain has made a decision based on his expertise. What expertise is required to read a ticket?" "Mrs. Palmer," Zoe asked, her tone genuinely curious rather than confrontational, "my boarding pass says 2A. Your boarding pass says—" Victoria's face flushed. "That's not relevant." "It seems entirely relevant," James Wilson interjected. "Perhaps you could clarify which seat you were actually assigned, Mrs. Palmer." The trap was set, and Victoria walked right into it. 24D, but that's beside the economy, Zoe stated, not triumphantly but matter-of-factly. You're attempting to use your connection with Captain Foster to take a seat that doesn't belong to you. Diego placed a hand on Foster's shoulder. Captain, we need to speak privately. Now. Foster shrugged him off, his composure cracking further. Remove your hand. First officer, this is my aircraft and I'm handling this situation. The tension in the cabin had escalated beyond a simple seating dispute. Now it was about power prejudice and pride, a toxic combination that everyone could feel. Is this really about airline protocol? Captain Zoe asked, her voice steady but resonant with deeper implications. Or is it about who you think belongs where? Enough. James Wilson rose from his seat, his 6'2" frame commanding attention. Captain Foster, as Skyway's Chief of Flight Operations, I'm formally requesting that you cease this inappropriate confrontation immediately. Foster turned sharply, his face a mask of barely contained fury. You don't have operational authority on my aircraft, Wilson. Actually, I do, Wilson replied calmly. And what I'm witnessing appears to be a clear violation of company policy regarding passenger treatment. The revelation of Wilson's position sent another ripple through the cabin. Passengers who had been uncertain whether to intervene now had a higher authority figure to validate their concerns. I'm a frequent flyer with Skyway. A businessman from 5C spoke up. I've never seen a captain attempt to relocate a properly ticketed passenger for someone else's convenience. This feels wrong. Victoria Palmer, sensing the tide turning completely against her attempted damage control. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was simply asking if... We all heard what you were asking. The elderly woman in 3A interrupted. And we all witnessed Captain Foster's attempt to intimidate a child. Disgraceful. Jennifer Collins stepped forward again, finding strength in the collective concern of the passengers. Captain, I need to note in my report that multiple passengers have expressed objections to this seating reassignment. Foster's hands clenched at his sides. The situation was spiraling beyond his control, witnesses multiplying, his authority eroding by the second. But something in him couldn't back down, perhaps pride, perhaps deeper prejudices, perhaps the simple inability to admit he'd been wrong. This is still my aircraft, he insisted, though his voice had lost some of its certainty, and I still have final authority over passenger seating. Then document your decision properly, Diego suggested, offering Foster a dignified retreat. File the appropriate reports, get authorization from operations. Follow protocol. Foster ignored the lifeline, focusing instead on Zoe, who continued recording the interaction. Put that phone away. Recording flight crew is against regulations. That's not accurate. A new voice joined in. The famous actor from 4B had removed his sunglasses, no longer concerned with anonymity. FAA regulations allow passengers to record personal events during boarding. I checked when a flight attendant tried to stop me last year. Zoe nodded slightly in acknowledgement without taking her eyes off Foster. I'm documenting what I believe to be discriminatory treatment, Captain. That's my right as a passenger. Foster stepped closer, invading her personal space in a clear attempt at intimidation. You have no idea who you're dealing with, young lady. I could say the same to you, Captain Zoe replied evenly. The cabin had become utterly silent, the standard pre-departure atmosphere of polite conversations and rustling newspapers completely gone. Every passenger was watching the confrontation unfold. Several had their phones out now, recording from different angles. Victoria Palmer, recognizing the growing public relations disaster, tried to extract herself from the situation. Perhaps I should take my assigned seat and we can discuss this after takeoff. Stay right there, Victoria Foster ordered without looking at her. We're resolving this now. From the rear of the first-class cabin, a Hispanic man in a business suit who had been quietly observing spoke up. My daughter is 13, just like this young lady. Would you speak to her this way? Captain, would you try to remove her from a seat she paid for? Foster didn't answer, but the implication hung in the air. James Wilson pulled out his phone. I'm contacting Alexander Morales directly. This has gone far enough." At the mention of the CEO's name, Foster's expression changed, the first flicker of real concern crossing his features. Consequences were becoming real immediate and potentially career-ending. "That won't be necessary," he said, attempting to regain control of the situation. "I'm simply enforcing standard protocols." "Which protocols specifically authorize removing a minor from her confirmed seat to accommodate another passenger's preference?" Wilson pressed. "I'd be very interested to review that section of our operations manual." Foster had no answer because no such protocol existed. The famous actor leaned forward. "I've got the whole thing recorded. Pretty sure the press would be interested in how Skyway treats its young passengers." "So do I," said the businessman from 5C, holding up his phone. And I added the elderly woman. In the span of minutes, Foster had managed to unite the entire first-class cabin against him. What had begun as a simple power play, moving a child he deemed unworthy of first class to accommodate someone from his social circle, had transformed into a public reckoning. And through it all, Zoe Jackson remained calm, poised and resolute, her phone still recording as Foster's authority crumbled around him. Foster's composure was unraveling visibly now. His face had turned an alarming shade of red, a vein pulsing at his temple as he struggled to maintain control of a situation that had long since escaped him. 23 years of unchecked authority hadn't prepared him for this moment. Being challenged, recorded, witnessed. "This ends now," he declared, his voice strained with barely contained rage. "Security will remove both this disruptive passenger and anyone else who interferes with flight operations." Diego stepped directly between Foster and Zoe. "Captain, you need to take a moment and consider what you're doing. This is going to follow you for the rest of your career." Foster's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening me?" "First Officer Hernandez, I'm trying to help you," Diego replied quietly. "Before you do something you can't take back." The cabin had become so silent that the ambient sounds of the airport outside seemed unnaturally loud. The distant rumble of jet engines, the beep of service vehicles backing up the muffled announcements from the terminal. Inside, the tension had reached a breaking point. Jennifer Collins moved to stand beside Zoe's seat, her decision made. If protecting this child cost her job, she would face that consequence. Some lines couldn't be crossed regardless of personal cost. "I'll need to file an incident report about this entire interaction," she stated clearly, including the attempt to reassign a confirmed first-class seat without proper authorization. Victoria Palmer, now thoroughly uncomfortable with her role in the escalating situation, attempted to retreat. "William, perhaps we should just be quiet." Victoria Foster snapped his professional facade, completely gone now. "I'm handling this." He turned back to Zoe, who continued recording steadily, her expression composed despite the hostility directed at her. Something about her calmness seemed to infuriate Foster further, as if her refusal to be intimidated was itself a challenge he couldn't tolerate. "I've had enough of this nonsense," he said, reaching for her phone. "Give me that device. Now." Zoe pulled the phone closer to her body, protective but not panicked. "You don't have the right to take my personal property, Captain. On my aircraft, I determine the rights," Foster declared, his voice rising as his control diminished. "That phone. Now." James Wilson began moving toward them, alarm evident in his expression. Diego tensed, ready to intervene physically if necessary. Jennifer positioned herself closer to Zoe's seat. "Captain Foster." Zoe said, her voice remaining steady even as the situation deteriorated. "You're being recorded by at least 7 different passengers right now. Whatever you're considering, please think carefully about the consequences." It was a mature warning, delivered with a clarity that belied her 13 years. But Foster was beyond rational thought, beyond professional considerations, beyond everything except the need to reassert control and authority that had never truly been challenged before this moment. "Last warning," he said, his right hand rising. Whether he intended to grab the phone or something worse would never be clear. The movement itself was aggressive, threatening, a physical escalation beyond anything acceptable from a captain toward a passenger, let alone a child. Time seemed to slow as multiple passengers gasped. Diego lunged forward. Jennifer called out a warning. James Wilson shouted, "Foster, don't!" But before anyone could intervene, something unexpected happened. Zoe's left hand shot up with surprising speed and caught Foster's wrist mid-motion, stopping it before it could complete its arc toward her. Her grip was firm, precise. Not violent, but unyielding. For 3 seconds, the tableau held. A 13-year-old girl physically blocking a grown man's aggressive gesture, their eyes locked in a moment of absolute clarity. Foster's expression registered shock, then embarrassment, then a dawning horror as he realized what he'd just done and what she'd just prevented him from doing. "Don't ever touch me," Zoe said, her voice quiet but carrying through the stunned silence of the cabin. The steel in her tone wasn't anger, but absolute certainty, the voice of someone who knew exactly where the boundaries were and would not allow them to be crossed. 3 more seconds passed before she released his wrist, letting his arm fall away. Foster staggered back slightly, the full impact of his actions beginning to register. He had just attempted to physically intimidate a child in front of a cabin full of witnesses with recording devices. Whatever happened next, his career as he knew it was over. As Foster's arm fell limply to his side, Zoe remained seated, her composure intact despite the shocking confrontation. The cabin was utterly silent, passengers frozen in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Even Victoria Palmer had backed away, her hand covering her mouth in horror. When Zoe spoke again, her voice was calm but resonant with quiet authority. "What you just attempted, Captain Foster, constitutes assault. Not just against any passenger, but against a minor. I defended myself, and everyone here saw what happened." The truth of her words hung in the air, undeniable. Foster's face had drained of color, the realization of his actions and their consequences, finally breaking through his rage. In that moment, Zoe's mind flashed back to a conversation with her mother 3 years earlier. They had been sitting in their kitchen after Zoe had come home upset from school, where a boy had pushed her during an argument. "Why didn't you push him back?" her mother had asked, surprising Zoe, who had expected praise for not fighting. "You always told me violence isn't the answer," Zoe had replied, confused. Dr. Jasmine Jackson had taken her daughter's hands in hers. "Violence as aggression isn't the answer. But defending yourself, that's different. Never let anyone violate your boundaries, Zoe. Never. But what if they're bigger, or stronger, or in charge?" Her mother's eyes had been fierce with protective love. "Then you stand your ground even more firmly. Fear is a choice. When someone wants you to be afraid, that's when you need to be brave. What if I can't?" "You can," Jasmine had assured her. "You're stronger than you know, and strength isn't about size or power. It's about knowing what's right and standing by it no matter what." That night, Jasmine had taught Zoe a simple wrist block, a defensive move she'd learned during hospital safety training. Not to hurt anyone, she'd explained, just to protect yourself if you need to. Now, as Zoe looked at Foster's shocked expression, her mother's words echoed in her mind. She hadn't been afraid because fear was a choice, and she had chosen dignity instead. "You should step back now," Captain Zoe suggested, not as a demand, but as guidance to someone who had lost his way. Diego moved forward cautiously. "Captain Foster, I think you need to leave the cabin and take a moment." Foster seemed unable to process what was happening, his world shifting beneath his feet. 23 years of authority, of deference, of power, all undermined in an instant by his own actions and the calm resistance of a 13-year-old girl. James Wilson pulled out his phone again. "I'm calling Alexander right now. This goes directly to the CEO." The mention of the CEO seemed to partially snap Foster back to reality. "I was just the phone I wasn't going to. "We all saw what happened," the elderly woman stated firmly. "You attempted to physically intimidate a child when she refused to give up her rightful seat." Several passengers nodded in agreement, their phones still recording. Jennifer stepped forward. "Captain, I believe you should return to the flight deck while we sort this out, for your own benefit." The suggestion was professional, but the implication was clear. Foster needed to be removed from the situation before he made things even worse for himself. Victoria Palmer, desperate to distance herself from the unfolding disaster, edged toward the aisle. "I should return to my assigned seat. This has clearly been a misunderstanding, and please remain here, Mrs. Palmer." James Wilson instructed, "This incident will need to be fully documented, including your role in it." Victoria's face paled, the reality of her complicity finally dawning on her. Through it all, Zoe continued recording, her hand steady. She wasn't vengeful or triumphant, just resolute. This wasn't about humiliating Foster or Victoria. It was about establishing that boundaries mattered, that dignity wasn't determined by age or appearance, that respect wasn't optional. "7 cameras are currently recording this incident," Zoe noted, gesturing around the cabin where multiple passengers had their phones raised. "I believe that's sufficient documentation of what occurred." Foster looked around, suddenly aware of just how public his breakdown had become. His career flashed before his eyes. Not just this job, but his entire professional identity. No airline would hire a captain who had been recorded attempting to physically intimidate a child passenger. "I wasn't going to." He began weakly but couldn't finish the sentence. The evidence was too clear, the witnesses too many. Diego placed a firm hand on Foster's shoulder. "Captain, you need to step away. Now." This time Foster didn't resist. The fight had drained out of him, replaced by the dawning comprehension of consequences. He allowed Diego to guide him toward the cockpit, his movements mechanical, his expression vacant. As Foster disappeared through the cockpit door, the tension in the cabin shifted. The immediate danger had passed, but the shock of what they had witnessed remained. Jennifer knelt beside Zoe's seat. "Are you all right?" Zoe nodded, finally lowering her phone. "I'm fine. Thank you for trying to help." "I should have done more," Jennifer admitted, regret evident in her voice. "I should have spoken up sooner." "You did speak up," Zoe replied. "That matters." In that exchange, the acknowledgement of both action and inaction, a deeper truth emerged about how injustice persisted not just through those who perpetrated it, but through those who recognized it and still hesitated to intervene. The first-class cabin of Flight 227 had transformed into something resembling a crime scene. Passengers spoke in hushed tones, comparing recordings, exchanging business cards as potential witnesses. Flight attendants huddled near the galley, their routine completely disrupted, uncertain how to proceed with normal service after such an extraordinary breach of protocol. James Wilson finished his phone call and approached Zoe's seat. "I just spoke with Alexander Morales," he said, his voice low but clear. "He's arranging for security to come on board, not to remove you, but to escort Captain Foster off the aircraft." Zoe nodded, absorbing this information with the same composure she'd maintained throughout the confrontation. "What about the flight? Will there be a delay?" The question, practical, focused on solutions rather than dwelling on the incident, seemed to surprise Wilson. "Yes, there will be some delay. They're arranging for a replacement captain to take over." Victoria Palmer, who had remained frozen near the bulkhead, suddenly found her voice. "This is completely ridiculous. We'll miss our connections in London, all because this child couldn't simply—" "Mrs. Palmer." Wilson interrupted sharply. "I strongly suggest you return to your assigned seat in economy and refrain from further comment. Your involvement in this situation has already been noted." The firmness of his tone left no room for argument. Victoria hesitated, then turned without another word and made her way toward the back of the aircraft, the weight of judging eyes following her retreat. Jennifer approached with a glass of water for Zoe. "Here," she said softly. You handled that with remarkable poise, but it must have been stressful. Zoe accepted the water with a small smile. Thank you. She took a sip, then added, My mother always said that staying calm during chaos is a superpower. Your mother sounds like a wise woman, Jennifer replied. A shadow crossed Zoe's face. She was. The past tense hung in the air between them, a small revelation of loss that explained something about the maturity beyond Zoe's years. In the cockpit, Diego had taken control of the situation. Foster sat in the captain's seat, staring blankly at the instrument panel, his career imploding around him. William Diego said, using Foster's first name for the first time, security will be here shortly. It would be better for everyone if you cooperate. Foster nodded mechanically. 23 years, he murmured. 23 years without an incident. Diego didn't correct him, though they both knew it wasn't true. There had been incidents. Complaints filed and buried reports, ignored, minorities intimidated or inconvenienced through random selection. This wasn't Foster's first transgression, just the first one that couldn't be hidden. Who is she? Foster finally asked. She said her name was Jackson. Not related to Thomas Jackson's daughter, Diego confirmed. The founder and majority shareholder of Skyway Airways. The color drained further from Foster's face. That's impossible. She's just a child who owns 65% of this airline through her family trust, Diego replied. The same airline you've worked for since its early days? Foster closed his eyes, the full magnitude of his error crushing down on him. Not only had he attempted to physically intimidate a minor, a fireable offense on its own, but he'd done it to the owner's daughter. There would be no recovery from this, no second chances, no colleagues to bury the complaint. Back in the cabin, 2 airport security officers had boarded and were speaking quietly with James Wilson. Passengers watched with a mixture of curiosity and satisfaction as the situation reached its inevitable conclusion. The elderly woman from 3A stopped beside Zoe's seat. I've been flying for over 50 years, dear, she said, her British accent crisp. What I witnessed today was appalling, but your response was extraordinary. Your parents must be very proud. Zoe touched her mother's pearl earring gently. Thank you. My father will be. The woman seemed to understand the subtle correction. She patted Zoe's hand and returned to her seat. The famous actor who had removed his sunglasses and hat completely now leaned across the aisle. Just so you know, I've got the whole thing recorded. If you need another witness statement, here's my card. Zoe accepted it with a polite nod, then turned her attention to the security officers now approaching the cockpit. The door opened and Foster emerged between them. His captain's hat held limply in his hands, his expression vacant. The symbol of authority he'd wielded so aggressively minutes earlier now seemed to weigh on him like a burden as he was escorted through the cabin. As he passed Zoe's seat, their eyes met briefly. There was no triumph in her gaze, no vindictiveness, just the steady, clear-eyed certainty of someone who had stood her ground against injustice and prevailed. Foster looked away first, unable to maintain contact with the quiet dignity he had failed to recognize and had tried to crush. Jennifer approached Zoe again as Foster was led off the aircraft. The CEO is on the phone, she said, holding out a handset. He'd like to speak with you. Zoe took the phone, her expression shifting to something more professional despite her age. Hello, Mr. Morales. As she listened to the CEO's words, the tension that had gripped the first-class cabin began to dissipate. Passengers returned to their conversations, though the incident remained the primary topic. Flight attendants resumed their preparation duties, though glances kept returning to the remarkable young girl in 2A who had stood against a captain and held her ground. Diego emerged from the cockpit, addressing the cabin with professional composure. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption to our service. A new captain is on the way to the aircraft now. We expect to depart within 30 minutes. Thank you for your patience and understanding during this unusual situation. as normalcy began to return gradually to Flight 227. Zoe concluded her call and handed the phone back to Jennifer. Then, with the same calm focus she'd displayed throughout the confrontation, she opened her tablet and returned to reviewing her presentation for tomorrow's shareholder meeting. A meeting that would now include an unexpected but necessary agenda item about passenger dignity and the culture of Skyway Airways. "Zoe, this is Alexander Morales. Are you all right?" The CEO's voice through the cabin phone was clear, concerned, and carried unmistakable authority. Zoe sat straight in seat 2A, her composure intact despite the extraordinary confrontation she'd just experienced. "I'm fine, Mr. Morales. The situation has been resolved." Around her Flight 227's first-class cabin was slowly returning to normal. Passengers stored their phones, though conversations still buzzed with whispered recounts of what they had witnessed. Flight attendants resumed preparation for departure, though their eyes frequently returned to the remarkable young girl who had stood her ground against a captain. "Tell me exactly what happened." Morales requested, his tone shifting from concern to controlled precision. Zoe recounted the events with clinical accuracy, Foster's attempt to move her to accommodate Victoria Palmer, the escalating confrontation, and finally his attempt to physically intimidate her. She spoke without embellishment or emotion, laying out facts as if presenting quarterly projections. "And you have this recorded?" Morales asked. "Yes, so do at least 7 other passengers." A brief silence on the line then. "Your father would be proud of how you handled this, Zoe." "I certainly am." Something in his words, the mention of her father, the acknowledgement of her composure, caused the first small crack in Zoe's carefully maintained facade. Her voice softened slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Morales. Captain Foster has been removed from the aircraft." Morales continued. "He's being escorted to my office as we speak. He will never fly for Skyway again. I can promise you that." Zoe nodded, though Morales couldn't see her. "What about Mrs. Palmer?" "The woman who tried to take your seat." There was a hint of disbelief in Morales's voice. "What would you recommend?" The question caught Zoe off guard. Adults rarely asked 13-year-olds for policy recommendations, especially concerning passenger discipline. But Morales wasn't just being kind. He was acknowledging her position as the daughter of the airline's founder and majority shareholder. "I think Zoe said carefully that Mrs. Palmer should be banned from first-class upgrades for a year, and perhaps required to complete a passenger etiquette course before that privilege is restored." Morales was quiet for a moment, then chuckled softly. "Measured fair with a path to redemption. That sounds exactly like something your father would suggest." Pride warmed Zoe's chest at the comparison, though her expression remained composed. "Is the flight still departing today?" "Yes. A replacement captain is already on his way to the gate. Flight 227 should be airborne within the hour." Morales paused. "Zoe, I know you're representing your father at the shareholder meeting tomorrow. After today's events, I'd like to add an agenda item addressing passenger dignity and respect. Would you be willing to speak to that issue?" "Yes," Zoe replied without hesitation. "I believe it's important. So do I. Now, is there anything else you need before takeoff?" Zoe glanced around the cabin where Jennifer Collins was watching her with a mixture of concern and admiration. "I think Jennifer Collins, the flight attendant who tried to intervene, deserves recognition." She stood up against her superior when she knew he was wrong. "I'll make note of that," Morales said. "And Zoe, safe travels. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow." As she handed the phone back to Jennifer, Zoe noticed the flight attendant's questioning look. "You mentioned me to the CEO. I mentioned that you tried to help Zoe confirmed. That matters." Jennifer's eyes widened slightly. "Thank you. I wish I'd done more." "You did something," Zoe replied. "Many people don't even do that." As Jennifer returned to her duties, Zoe became aware of the passengers watching her with newfound respect. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, from seeing a child seemingly out of place in first class to recognizing someone whose composure and dignity had revealed her true belonging. James Wilson approached her seat, keeping his voice low. "Your father doesn't know about this yet, does he know? He had a minor heart attack yesterday. He's stable, but the doctors advised against stressors." Wilson nodded understanding. "I won't contact him then. But Zoe, what you did today, standing your ground like that, it was remarkable. I just did what my mother taught me." Zoe replied, touching her pearl earring, "To know my worth, and never let anyone make me feel small." From the cockpit doorway, Diego Hernandez made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, our replacement captain has arrived. We'll begin departure procedures shortly. Thank you for your patience during this delay." As if on cue, a distinguished man in a captain's uniform entered the aircraft. Unlike Foster, whose authority had seemed brittle and defensive, this captain carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Captain Robert Chen. I apologize for the delay and unusual circumstances. We should be airborne within 15 minutes. He paused as he passed Zoe's seat, offering a respectful nod. "Miss Jackson, I flew with your father when we only had 3 aircraft. He built something special with Skyway. We'll get you to London safely for your meeting." The simple acknowledgement that she belonged not just in the seat but in the company's legacy resonated through Zoe with unexpected power. She nodded back, suddenly grateful that her father had insisted she make this journey. As the replacement captain entered the cockpit, passengers settled into their seats. Electronic devices were stowed and Flight 227 finally prepared for departure. 9 hours late, but somehow more united than any flight Zoe had ever experienced. That's Thomas Jackson's daughter. The whispers spread through the cabin as Flight 227 reached cruising altitude. Passengers who had witnessed the confrontation were now connecting the dots, understanding exactly who the composed 13-year-old in 2A truly was. Jackson, as in the founder of Skyway. The one who started with a single plane 20 years ago, I heard he owns 65% of the company. Zoe pretended not to hear, focusing on her tablet as the seatbelt sign switched off. She was reviewing her shareholder presentation again, though her mind occasionally drifted to the confrontation with Foster and what it revealed about the airline her father had built. James Wilson unbuckled his seatbelt and moved to the empty seat beside her. "May I?" Zoe nodded, setting her tablet aside. "Your father doesn't know anything about what happened, does he?" Wilson asked, quietly. "No. And I'd prefer to keep it that way until his doctors clear him for stress." Wilson nodded, understanding. "Of course. But Zoe, I think there's something you should know. What happened today, I don't think it was an isolated incident." Zoe's eyes sharpened with interest. "The declining satisfaction scores among minority first-class passengers." Wilson looked surprised. "You know about that?" "It was in the quarterly report. Appendix C, page 47. Satisfaction among minority passengers in premium cabins has dropped 7% over the last year." Wilson stared at her for a moment, then chuckled softly. "You really are Thomas's daughter. Yes, that's exactly what I'm referring to. I've suspected for some time that certain crew members, Foster included, have been creating an unwelcoming environment for passengers they deem unconventional for premium cabins. Meaning passengers of color," Zoe stated simply. "Yes." Wilson's expression grew serious. "I've tried investigating, but the complaints are often subtle. Uncomfortable interactions, excessive documentation checks, seating errors. Nothing concrete enough to build a case. Until today. The investigation couldn't progress because of this informal network protecting each other," Zoe observed. Foster and his golf buddy in HR burying reports, other managers looking the other way. Wilson's eyebrows rose. How did you... It's a classic organizational problem. Informal networks undermining formal procedures. Dad's dealt with it before in other companies we've acquired. These shadow systems tend to develop when long-tenured employees feel threatened by change. Wilson nodded, slowly impressed. That's exactly it. But today broke that pattern wide open. What Foster did was too public, too extreme to be buried. Your presence as a catalyst was unexpected, but perhaps necessary. Zoe was quiet for a moment, processing this information. The data told us something was wrong. We just didn't know exactly what. Data can identify patterns, but it takes human experience to understand them. Wilson agreed. Your experience today revealed something that months of reports couldn't capture. The actual behavior happening on board our aircraft. In economy class, Victoria Palmer sat seething in her assigned seat, 24D, a middle seat in the center section. Her expensive handbag was crammed under the seat in front of her, her knees pressed against the seat back, her carefully applied makeup already feeling stale without the champagne and hot towel service she'd expected to enjoy. The humiliation burned worse than the discomfort. William Foster had promised her special treatment, leveraging their country club connection for preferential service. Instead, she'd been publicly exposed and sent back to her assigned seat like a scolded child. "Excuse me," she said sharply to a passing flight attendant. "I need to speak with someone about what happened earlier. This is completely unacceptable treatment for an elite status member." The flight attendant, not Jennifer but another crew member who had been briefed on the situation, gave her a professional but cool smile. "I understand you're uncomfortable, Mrs. Palmer. I'll note your complaint in my report. Would you like a beverage while you wait?" "I don't want a beverage. I want to speak with whoever's in charge. Captain Chen is currently flying the aircraft, ma'am. He can't be disturbed, but I can arrange for a customer service representative to meet you upon landing in London." Victoria fumed silently as the attendant moved on. Her phone buzzed with an incoming email. The subject line made her blood run cold. Notice of status review, Skyway Airways. She opened it with trembling fingers. The message was brief but devastating. Dear Mrs. Palmer, this notice confirms that your elite status privileges with Skyway Airways are under immediate review following an incident on Flight 227 JFK LHR on October 14, 2025. During this review period, your eligibility for complimentary upgrades and priority boarding has been suspended. A customer service representative will contact you within 48 hours to discuss this matter further. Skyway Airways. Victoria's face flushed with embarrassment and rage. Her husband would be furious. Richard Palmer's investment firm handled transportation sector portfolios worth billions. This could affect business relationships, social standing, their entire carefully cultivated image. And all because of a child who turned out to be the owner's daughter. Panic rising. Victoria composed an email to her husband Richard. There's been a terrible misunderstanding on my flight. The airline is threatening my status. This is humiliating and could affect your business relationships. We need to address this immediately. She knew she was in trouble. Richard prized social standing above all else, and her public embarrassment would reflect badly on him. The fact that she'd been caught trying to bully her way into a seat that wasn't hers would be in his eyes not a moral failure, but a strategic one. She had been caught. In the cockpit of Flight 227, First Officer Diego Hernandez was briefing Captain Robert Chen on the incident during their routine cross-Atlantic communications check. "I've never seen anything like it," Diego admitted. Foster completely lost control. If the girl hadn't blocked his hand, I think he might have struck her. Chen shook his head. "I flew with Bill Foster 15 years ago. He was always rigid old school. But this goes beyond that. This is a complete violation of everything we stand for as pilots." The worst part is, I think it's been happening for years, just in smaller ways, less visible incidents. The girl in 2A just happened to be the one who stood her ground. Chen adjusted their heading slightly, then glanced at Diego. And also happened to be Thomas Jackson's daughter. That's quite a coincidence. I don't think it was coincidence, Diego replied. I think it was inevitable. Foster had been getting away with this behavior for so long that he thought he was untouchable. It was only a matter of time before he crossed the wrong person. In first class, Zoe had returned to her presentation, but her mind kept circling back to something Wilson had said: data can identify patterns, but it takes human experience to understand them. Her own experience today had revealed something no report could capture: the lived reality of being deemed out of place based solely on appearance. While Foster's behavior had been extreme, she wondered how many smaller incidents occurred daily across Skyway's fleet. How many passengers felt unwelcome or questioned in spaces they had every right to occupy. Jennifer approached with a light dinner service. We'll be landing in London in about 4 hours. Would you like chicken or pasta? Chicken, please, Zoe replied. As Jennifer arranged the tray, Zoe added, May I ask you something? Of course. Have you witnessed situations like today's before? Maybe not as extreme, but similar? Questioning of passengers who don't fit someone's expectation. Jennifer hesitated, glancing around to ensure no other crew members were within earshot. Yes, she admitted quietly. Not usually from captains, but from certain flight attendants, gate agents. Little comments, extra ID checks, seating errors that always seem to affect the same types of passengers. And what happens when these incidents are reported? Jennifer's expression told the story before her words did. Reports get filed. Nothing changes. Zoe nodded slowly, understanding, crystallizing. What had happened to her wasn't just about one captain's prejudice or one passenger's entitlement. It was about a culture that had quietly diverged from her father's founding vision, a culture where some passengers were treated as more deserving than others, where complaints from certain people weren't taken seriously, where staff like Foster could act with impunity. As Jennifer moved on to the next row, Zoe made a note on her tablet, adding a new slide to tomorrow's presentation, Passenger Dignity Initiative. The data had shown them there was a problem. Her experience had revealed exactly what that problem was. Now it was time to fix it. Alexander Morales stood at the window of his 47th floor office in Skyway's Manhattan headquarters, watching evening descend over the city. Behind him, his assistant Veronica waited silently, tablet in hand. Has security arrived with Foster yet? Morales asked without turning. Yes, sir. They're escorting him to the conference room as instructed. Morales nodded. In 20 years at Skyway, 15 as CEO, he had never faced a situation quite like this. A captain, one of their most senior pilots, had attempted to physically intimidate a 13-year-old passenger who happened to be the founder's daughter. The potential damage was incalculable, legally, reputationally, financially. But more than that, it violated everything Thomas Jackson had built Skyway to represent. The recordings, he asked. We've received 3 so far. Legal is reviewing them now. They're quite damning, sir. Morales turned from the window. At 54, he carried himself with the measured confidence of someone who had risen through merit rather than connection. Thomas Jackson had hired him when Skyway consisted of 3 aircraft and a dream. Together, they had built it into a global carrier with 200 planes and routes spanning 5 continents. Now that legacy was at risk. What about passenger notifications? Veronica consulted her tablet. All first-class passengers on Flight 227 have been contacted. They're being offered full refunds, additional travel vouchers, and a personal apology from the airline. And Mrs. Palmer. Her elite status has been suspended pending review as you instructed. Morales nodded, straightening his tie. Let's not keep our former captain waiting. The conference room fell silent as Morales entered. William Foster sat at the far end of the table, still in his uniform, though his captain's wings had been removed. Security personnel stood discreetly near the door. Foster's eyes, once commanding, now darted nervously around the room. Captain Foster Morales began, then stopped himself. "Mr. Foster, I've reviewed the preliminary reports from Flight 227. Before we proceed further, do you have anything you'd like to say?" Foster straightened in his seat, attempting to reclaim some dignity. "Mr. Morales, there's been a misunderstanding." The girl was disruptive. "I was attempting to maintain order and stop." Morales's voice wasn't loud, but it carried unmistakable authority. "We have recordings from multiple passengers. There's no point in fabricating a narrative that contradicts visual evidence." Foster's face flushed. "I didn't know who she was." "Would it have mattered? Would you have treated any other 13-year-old passenger differently if they weren't Thomas Jackson's daughter?" The question hung in the air, revealing the core of the issue. Foster's silence was answer enough. Morales placed his tablet on the conference table, turning it to display an image paused from one of the recordings. Foster, with his hand raised toward Zoe the moment before she blocked him. "This isn't just about today, is it, William? This is about a pattern of behavior that's been occurring for years. Complaints buried, reports ignored, certain passengers made to feel unwelcome in premium cabins." Foster's eyes widened slightly, surprised that Morales knew, or perhaps that anyone had noticed at all. "You've been with Skyway for 23 years, Morales continued. "You joined when we were still a regional carrier. You've seen us grow, evolve, establish ourselves as a global airline. And throughout that time, you've carried this perspective, that some passengers belong and others don't, that it's your job to enforce that distinction. That's not—" "It is," Morales interrupted firmly. "And it stops today. Your employment with Skyway Airways is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building once you've surrendered your credentials and company property." Foster stared in disbelief. 23 years and you're firing me over one incident?" "No, I'm firing you because you attempted to physically intimidate a minor. I'm firing you because you abused your authority to discriminate against passengers. I'm firing you because you violated everything this airline stands for." Morales leaned forward. "And I'm only sorry it didn't happen sooner." Foster seemed to shrink in his seat, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. "My pension will be processed according to the terms of your employment contract. Legal will contact you." Morales nodded to security. "Please escort Mr. Foster to HR to complete his exit paperwork." As Foster was led from the room, Morales turned to Veronica. "Get me Samantha Rodriguez from HR. I want every complaint filed against Foster for the last 5 years, every incident report, every passenger feedback form that mentions his name." "Yes, sir. And contact Diego Hernandez, the first officer on Flight 227. I want to speak with him directly when they land in London." Veronica nodded, making notes. "Anything else?" Morales paused, considering. "Yes. I want a company-wide communication drafted. Every employee needs to understand that what happened today is unacceptable and will never be tolerated at Skyway. This isn't just about one captain or one incident. This is about who we are as a company." As Veronica left to carry out his instructions, Morales returned to the window, watching the city lights emerge against the darkening sky. Thomas Jackson had built Skyway on a simple principle: excellence for everyone, regardless of background, appearance, or status. Somewhere along the way, that vision had been compromised. It was time to reclaim it. 14 complaints, Samantha Rodriguez said, spreading the documents across Morales's desk. 14 formal complaints about Foster's behavior toward minority passengers in first class over the past 5 years. All dismissed, all buried. Morales stared at the evidence, a sick feeling growing in his stomach. How did I not know about this? Rodriguez Skyway's HR director for the past 8 years shook her head. They never reached your level. They were intercepted and dismissed by Andrew Wilson in middle management. He's Foster's golf buddy, former fraternity brother. And you're just discovering this now. I ordered a complete audit after you called about the incident on Flight 227. Rodriguez's expression was grim. It gets worse. Foster isn't the only one. We've identified at least 7 other captains and 12 flight attendants with similar patterns of complaints, all handled by the same network of managers, all dismissed as misunderstandings or passenger sensitivity. Morales pushed back from his desk, the implications staggering. This wasn't just one rogue captain. This was an entire shadow system operating within his airline. People protecting each other, burying complaints, maintaining a culture of exclusion under a veneer of professionalism. Names, he said quietly. I want the name of every employee involved in this, every manager who buried a complaint, every crew member who generated multiple reports. I've compiled the list, Rodriguez said, handing him another folder. But Alex, this goes beyond individual bad actors. This is a structural issue. Explain. Our reporting system allows complaints to be filtered through multiple layers before reaching executive review. That creates opportunities for interference. Our training emphasizes technical compliance but doesn't adequately address unconscious bias. Our hiring still relies heavily on traditional aviation networks which lack diversity. Morales nodded slowly, taking it all in. What's your recommendation? Complete overhaul. New reporting systems that bypass middle management. Mandatory training for all customer-facing staff. Independent review board for passenger complaints. Recruitment diversification. Rodriguez paused. It won't be cheap or easy. But necessary, Morales finished. Absolutely necessary. What happened to Zoe Jackson today was the visible tip of a much larger problem. How many passengers have experienced similar treatment without the power to fight back? How many have simply chosen never to fly with us again? The question hung in the air, damning in its implications. Morales thought about Thomas Jackson, still recovering from his heart attack, unaware that the company he built was falling short of his founding vision. Draft a comprehensive reform plan, Morales instructed. I want it ready before the shareholder meeting tomorrow. Zoe Jackson will be there representing her father. I've already promised her we'd address passenger dignity on the agenda. You think the board will approve the necessary budget? Rodriguez asked. They'll approve it, Morales said with certainty, because the alternative is explaining to Thomas Jackson why we allowed his airline to become a place where his daughter was treated like she didn't belong. In another part of the building, Andrew Wilson sat staring at his computer screen, reading the company-wide email that had just arrived to all Skyway Airways employees. Today, an incident occurred on Flight 227 that violated our most fundamental values as a company. A captain attempted to physically intimidate a 13-year-old passenger after trying to remove her from her rightfully assigned first-class seat. This behavior was not only unprofessional and potentially illegal, it was a complete contradiction of everything Skyway Airways stands for. The captain in question has been terminated. A full investigation is underway to determine how this situation was allowed to develop and what structural changes are needed to ensure it never happens again. Let me be absolutely clear. There is no place at Skyway for discrimination of any kind. Every passenger who purchases a ticket deserves to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of age, race, gender, or appearance. In the coming days, you will receive information about enhanced training programs and new reporting procedures. These are not optional. They are essential to our identity as an airline and our success as a business. Skyway was founded on the principle that excellence is for everyone. Today, we redouble our commitment to that vision. Alexander Morales, Chief Executive Officer, Skyway. Airways Wilson deleted the email with a shaking hand, then began frantically searching his files. How many of Foster's complaint reports had he buried over the years? How many other friends had he protected? The paper trail would be discoverable in the system logs, the pattern unmistakable once someone started looking. His phone rang, displaying HR, Rodriguez S. Wilson stared at it, knowing exactly what the call meant. His time at Skyway was over. In the operations center, news of the incident spread quickly among dispatchers, planners, and support staff. The airline's complex machinery continued functioning. Flights departed, passengers were checked, and cargo was loaded. But beneath the routine operations, a reckoning had begun. "Did you hear about Flight 227?" whispered a young dispatcher to her colleague. "Captain tried to hit a kid in first class." "No way." "Who, Foster?" "Apparently he tried to give the kid's seat to some rich lady, then lost it when she wouldn't move." "Foster." The colleague shook his head. "I'm not surprised. Remember last year when he insisted on random security checks for those Nigerian business travelers? All 6 of them, all in first class. Their supervisor approached and they quickly returned to their monitors. But the conversation was happening throughout the building, in break rooms and cubicles, in executive offices and maintenance hangars. The incident on Flight 227 had exposed something many employees had sensed, but few had openly acknowledged that within Skyway Airways, an airline built on the principle of equality, some passengers were being treated as more equal than others. And for the first time in years, that was about to change. Flight 227 cruised at 38,000 feet over the Atlantic. The cabin lights dimmed to allow passengers to rest during the overnight journey to London. But sleep eluded many in first class, the earlier confrontation still resonating through their shared space. Zoe sat with her tablet, finalizing her presentation for tomorrow's meeting. The new slide, Passenger Dignity Initiative, had evolved from a single bullet point to a comprehensive proposal with concrete actions, timelines, and accountability measures. Jennifer approached with a cup of herbal tea. "I thought you might like this," she said, placing it on Zoe's tray table. "It helps with sleep on long flights." "Thank you." Zoe accepted the tea gratefully. "You're not required to give me special treatment, you know. I'm just a regular passenger." Jennifer smiled. "This isn't special treatment. It's just kindness. And after what happened earlier, well, I think we could all use some." As Jennifer moved on, James Wilson stopped by Zoe's seat. Working late, Zoe nodded, adding some new elements to tomorrow's presentation. "May I?" Wilson gestured to her tablet. Zoe hesitated only briefly before turning the screen toward him. Wilson reviewed her additions, eyebrows rising with each slide. "This is comprehensive," he said finally. "Anonymous reporting system, mandatory dignity training, passenger bill of rights, independent review board." He looked at her with newfound respect. "You developed all this since the incident. I had been thinking about the customer satisfaction data already," Zoe explained. "Today's experience just helped me understand what the numbers were trying to tell us." Wilson handed back the tablet. "The board won't approve all of this immediately. Budget concerns, implementation challenges. They'll approve it," Zoe replied with quiet certainty. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because the alternative is explaining to my father why Skyway has become a place where certain passengers are made to feel unwelcome." Wilson chuckled softly. "You are definitely Thomas Jackson's daughter." He returned to his seat, leaving Zoe to her work. Across the aisle, the elderly British woman from 3A watched the exchange with interest. As Zoe returned to her tablet, the woman leaned over slightly. "I hope you don't mind my saying so, but you remind me very much of my late husband," she said. He had that same quiet determination. Never raised his voice, never lost his composure, but absolutely immovable when it came to matters of principle. Zoe looked up intrigued. What did he do? He was a civil rights attorney in London during the 1960s and 70s. Fought discrimination in housing, employment, education. Always said that the most important battles weren't the loud public ones, but the quiet daily insistences on dignity. "That sounds like my mother," Zoe said softly. She was a cardiac surgeon. one of the few black women in her field. She always said excellence wasn't about being exceptional. It was about insisting on being treated normally. The woman nodded understanding. Precisely. And what you did today, refusing to be moved, standing your ground with such composure, that was exactly the kind of quiet insistence that creates real change. In the galley, Jennifer was preparing for the breakfast service that would begin in a few hours. The famous actor approached, keeping his voice low. "I sent the recording to my publicist," he said. "Not to release publicly, that's your airline's business, but to archive properly in case it's needed. What that captain did was wrong on every level." Jennifer nodded appreciation. "Thank you. I should have spoken up sooner. I knew what he was doing wasn't right." "Fear is a powerful silencer," the actor said. "Trust me, I understand. I've been in rooms where I knew something was wrong but stayed quiet to protect my career. It's a choice we all face. Some of us face it more than others." Jennifer replied, thinking of how frequently she'd witnessed similar, if less extreme, incidents during her short career. "True," the actor acknowledged, "which is why those of us with privilege need to speak up more often." He hesitated, then added, "Send my contact information to your legal department. I'm happy to provide a formal statement about what I witnessed." In the cockpit, Captain Chen and First Officer Diego were discussing the incident during their routine mid-flight check. "I've known Thomas Jackson for 20 years, Chen said, adjusting their course slightly to avoid turbulence. "Started flying with him when Skyway was still operating out of a converted warehouse. He built this airline on respect, for employees, for passengers, for everyone. What happened today would break his heart." Diego nodded. "The thing is, this wasn't isolated. Foster has a history of this behavior. I've heard rumors, seen small incidents. Nothing this extreme, but the pattern was there, and no one reported it. People reported. Nothing happened." Diego checked their fuel consumption, then continued. "There's a network within the company, old guard types who protect each other. Foster was part of it. They bury complaints, dismiss reports as misunderstandings." Chen was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "Well, they can't bury what happened today. Too many witnesses, too much evidence. And the fact that it was Thomas Jackson's daughter, that makes it impossible to ignore. It shouldn't have taken that," Diego said. "Any passenger deserves better treatment, but maybe this is the catalyst Skyway needed." Back in the cabin, Zoe had finally set aside her tablet fatigue, beginning to overcome her determination. As she reclined her seat slightly, she noticed something unexpected. Passengers throughout first class offering her small gestures of solidarity. The businessman from 5C raised his water glass in a subtle toast. The elderly British woman gave her a gentle pat on the arm as she passed to the lavatory. The famous actor nodded respectful acknowledgement. These weren't gestures of pity or even admiration. They were recognitions of belonging. Quiet affirmations that Zoe was exactly where she should be, not despite who she was, but because of it. As sleep finally claimed her, Zoe's hand drifted unconsciously to her mother's pearl earring. Somewhere over the mid-Atlantic, as Flight 227 continued its journey to London, the 13-year-old who had stood against discrimination slept peacefully in seat 2A, the very seat she had defended with dignity and determination. Dawn painted the London skyline in soft pinks and golds as Flight 227 began its final descent into Heathrow Airport. After the turbulence of the previous day's events, the smooth approach seemed almost metaphorical, conflict giving way to clarity, chaos resolving into purpose. Zoe woke as the breakfast service began, the aroma of coffee and warm pastries filling the cabin. She straightened her seat, checking her appearance in the small mirror from her carry-on. Despite the overnight flight, she looked composed. Her burgundy blazer barely creased her mother's pearl earrings, catching the early morning light. "Good morning," Jennifer greeted her voice, warm with genuine respect. "We'll be landing in about 40 minutes. Would you like coffee or orange juice with your breakfast?" "Orange juice, please," Zoe replied. "And thank you for everything yesterday." Jennifer's expression softened. "I wish I'd done more sooner." "You did something," Zoe said. "That matters." As the breakfast trays were cleared and the aircraft began its final approach, Zoe checked her phone for messages. 3 texts from her father. "Just heard from Alexander about the incident on your flight. Are you all right? So proud of how you handled yourself. Your mother would be too. Call me when you land, no matter what time." Zoe smiled, relieved that her father knew and was proud rather than worried. She typed a quick reply. "Landing soon. I'm fine. We'll call after clearing customs. Love you." The distinctive announcement chime sounded and Captain Chen's voice came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach to London Heathrow. Local time is 7:15 a.m. Temperature is a pleasant 16 degrees Celsius. On behalf of the entire crew, I want to thank you for your patience and understanding during yesterday's unfortunate incident. Skyway Airways is committed to ensuring that every passenger is treated with dignity and respect on every flight. We hope to demonstrate that commitment through our actions going forward." The subtle reference to yesterday's events and the promise of change resonated through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, the shared experience, creating an unusual bond. "We'll be on the ground in approximately 15 minutes, Chen continued. "Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." As the aircraft descended through the clouds over London, Zoe gazed out the window, thinking about the shareholder meeting scheduled for 10:00 a.m. at the Dorchester Hotel. She had prepared diligently for the financial presentation, memorizing every projection, anticipating every question about quarterly performance and strategic direction. But now she had a different mission as well, one that transcended numbers and charts, one that spoke to the very soul of her father's company. The landing was smooth, the aircraft touching down with barely a bump before taxiing toward Terminal 5. As passengers began gathering their belongings, James Wilson leaned across the aisle. "There will be a car waiting for you at the arrivals area," he said. "Company protocol for board members and executives. The driver will have your name on a placard." "Thank you," Zoe replied, slightly surprised by the courtesy. Wilson smiled. "You earned it, not because of your last name, but because of how you conducted yourself yesterday. That kind of composure under pressure. It's rare at any age." The aircraft reached its gate, the seatbelt sign chimed off, and passengers began the familiar ritual of deplaning. Unusually for first class, no one rushed to be first off the plane. Instead, passengers stepped aside, allowing Zoe to exit ahead of them, a small gesture of respect that spoke volumes. Captain Chen stood at the cockpit door, thanking passengers as they departed. When Zoe approached, he offered a genuine smile. "Miss Jackson, it was an honor to fly you to London today. Please give your father my best wishes for a speedy recovery." "I will, Captain Chen. Thank you." As Zoe walked through the jet bridge, she could sense something had fundamentally changed. Yesterday, she had boarded Flight 227 as a 13-year-old girl whose presence in first class was questioned and challenged. Today, she deplaned as someone whose right to be there had been affirmed, not granted as a privilege but recognized as inherent. The terminal was bustling with morning arrivals, passengers streaming toward customs and baggage claim. Zoe navigated through the crowd with practiced ease, her carry-on rolling smoothly behind her. Her phone vibrated with an incoming text from Alexander Morales. "Zoe, I've briefed the board on yesterday's incident and your proposed passenger dignity initiative. They're prepared to hear your presentation as the first agenda item. Call me when you reach your hotel." She smiled, slipping the phone back into her blazer pocket. Things were already in motion. After clearing customs, Zoe entered the arrivals hall, scanning the crowd for her driver. She spotted a man in a dark suit holding a placard with Jackson Z printed in bold letters. As she approached him, a voice called from behind her. "Zoe." She turned to see a tall man with her father's eyes and smile, dressed in a business suit that couldn't quite hide his athletic build. Uncle Marcus' surprise and delight colored her voice. Marcus Jackson, her father's younger brother and Skyway's chief innovation officer, wasn't supposed to be in London. He embraced her warmly. "Your dad called me last night after he heard what happened. I took the red-eye to be here for your presentation." He held her at arm's length, studying her face. "Are you really okay?" "I'm fine," she assured him. "It was intense, but I handled it." "So I heard. Standing your ground against a senior captain, recording the whole thing, catching his wrist when he tried to intimidate you." Pride shone in his eyes. "Your mom taught you well." Zoe touched her pearl earring. She did. Marcus signaled to the driver, who collected Zoe's carry-on. "The car's waiting. We've got about 2 hours before the meeting. Enough time to get you settled at the hotel and go over your presentation." As they walked toward the exit, Marcus's expression grew more serious. "Zoe, what happened yesterday? It wasn't just about one bad captain." "I know," she replied. "It's about a culture that's developed within parts of the airline. A culture that contradicts everything Dad built Skyway to represent." Marcus nodded, impressed by her perception. "Exactly. And that's why your voice at today's meeting is so important. The board needs to hear not just about quarterly numbers, but about the human experience of flying with us, both good and bad." Outside London's morning sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the waiting car. As the driver opened the door, Zoe paused, looking back at the terminal where Flight 227 had arrived. Yesterday had been about defending her seat. Today would be about ensuring no one else ever had to defend theirs. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board, before we begin our scheduled financial review, I'd like to address an incident that occurred yesterday on Flight 227 from New York to London." Alexander Morales stood at the head of the polished conference table in the Dorchester Hotel's executive meeting room. Morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating the faces of 22 board members and major shareholders gathered for Skyway Airways' quarterly meeting. Zoe sat beside her Uncle Marcus, her tablet ready with her presentation. She wore her burgundy blazer, crisp white blouse, and her mother's pearl earrings. Professional attire that somehow made her 13 years seem less incongruous in this room of power and influence. For those who haven't yet been briefed, Morales continued. A senior captain attempted to forcibly remove Zoe Jackson from her assigned first-class seat to accommodate another passenger with an economy ticket. When Zoe refused to move, the captain escalated the situation to the point of attempting physical intimidation. The entire incident was recorded by multiple passengers. Murmurs rippled around the table. Several board members glanced at Zoe with expressions ranging from concern to curiosity. "Captain Foster has been terminated," Morales stated firmly, "but this incident has revealed deeper issues within our airline that require immediate attention. I've invited Zoe to present not only her scheduled financial report, but also a proposal addressing passenger dignity and respect, values that should be non-negotiable at Skyway." He turned to Zoe. "Miss Jackson, the floor is yours." Zoe rose, connecting her tablet to the room's display system. The Skyway Airways logo appeared on the large screen behind her, followed by the title slide, Q3 Financial Performance and Passenger Dignity Initiative. "Thank you, Mr. Morales." Her voice was clear and steady, betraying none of the nervousness one might expect from a 13-year-old addressing a room of executives. "Before I begin, I want to clarify something. I'm not presenting today because of what happened to me personally. I'm presenting because what happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone, regardless of who they are or who their father is." The directness of her statement commanded attention. Board members who had been checking emails or reviewing documents looked up, giving her their full focus. "As you can see from the first section of my report, Skyway's financial performance for Q3 exceeded projections in most key metrics." Zoe moved efficiently through the financial data, demonstrating a command of the material that impressed even the most skeptical board members. Revenue figures, cost analyses, competitive positioning. She presented each with clarity and precision. Then she paused, changing to a slide that hadn't been in the original deck. However, there's one metric that deserves special attention. In Appendix C of your reports, page 47, you'll notice that customer satisfaction among minority passengers in premium cabins has declined by 7% over the past year. She highlighted the figure, enlarging it on screen. Initially, this might appear to be a statistical anomaly, but in light of recent events, I believe it represents something more significant, a pattern of experiences that contradicts Skyway's core values. A board member, Richard Bennett, head of the Finance Committee, leaned forward. "Miss Jackson, while yesterday's incident was certainly unfortunate, isn't it possible you're reading too much into one data point?" "That's a fair question, Mr. Bennett," Zoe acknowledged. "But this isn't about one data point or one incident. This is about what that data is trying to tell us." She advanced to her next slide, a compilation of passenger comments extracted from satisfaction surveys, all from minority travelers in premium cabins, all describing subtle forms of disrespect or different treatment. These comments, collected over the past year, reveal a consistent pattern, Zoe explained. Passengers being asked to verify their tickets multiple times, seating errors that always seem to affect certain demographics, service delays or omissions that show statistical correlation with passenger appearance. The room grew quiet as board members absorbed the implications. What had happened to Zoe wasn't an isolated incident, but the most visible manifestation of a troubling pattern. "Yesterday I experienced firsthand what these numbers represent." Zoe continued. "Captain Foster didn't know who I was. He simply saw someone he decided didn't belong in first class based on how I looked. And he was willing to use his authority to remove me, even resorting to attempted physical intimidation when challenged." She advanced to the next slide, Passenger Dignity Initiative. "What I'm proposing isn't just a response to one incident. It's a recommitment to the principles my father built this airline upon. That excellence is for everyone, that respect isn't determined by appearance, and that dignity isn't a premium service but a basic right." As Zoe outlined her proposal, comprehensive reforms to reporting structures, training programs, accountability measures, the boardroom remained silent, executives taking notes and exchanging glances that acknowledged both the necessity and the ambition of what she was suggesting. For 20 minutes, Zoe Jackson commanded the room not through force of personality, but through the quiet power of truth, clearly spoken. When she finished returning to her seat beside Marcus, the silence lingered for several seconds before Alexander Morales stood again. "Thank you, Zoe." His voice carried genuine respect. "I believe what we've just heard requires immediate board consideration and action." The discussion that followed was vigorous but focused. Some board members raised concerns about implementation costs and timelines. Others questioned whether such comprehensive reforms were necessary based on one incident. But as the conversation progressed, it became clear that momentum was building toward substantive change. Throughout the discussion, Zoe remained composed, answering questions with precision and clarity when addressed, but never dominating the conversation. This wasn't about her asserting authority. It was about guiding the airline back to its founding principles. When the vote finally came, it was unanimous. The Passenger Dignity Initiative was approved in full, with implementation to begin immediately. As board members gathered their materials at the meeting's conclusion, several approached Zoe directly. "Remarkable presentation," said Elizabeth Garcia, head of the Customer Experience Committee. "Your father would be proud." "Thomas taught you well," added Jonathan Harris, one of Skyway's original investors. "But there's something of your mother in you, too, that same unwavering clarity." Zoe accepted their comments with grace, but her attention was drawn to Alexander Morales, who stood at the room's center making an announcement. "I've just received word that our investigation into yesterday's incident has expanded. We've identified multiple employees who systematically buried complaints similar to what Zoe experienced. Those individuals are being suspended pending further review. He looked directly at Zoe. This is just the beginning. What you've initiated today will transform Skyway Airways from the inside out. As the room cleared, Marcus placed a hand on his niece's shoulder. You did good, Zoe. Really good. She smiled, touching her pearl earring gently. Mom would have done the same. Marcus nodded. Yes, she would have, but she couldn't have done it better. Before we examine the proposed solutions, let's understand the scope of the problem, Zoe said, advancing to a slide titled Pattern Analysis, Passenger Experience Discrepancies. The boardroom remained attentive as Zoe methodically built her case. Unlike many presentations they'd seen, hers wasn't filled with corporate jargon or vague objectives. Instead, she presented clear evidence. Complaint patterns, statistical anomalies, and direct passenger feedback, all pointing to a troubling reality within Skyway Airways. Over the past 18 months, minority passengers in premium cabins have been 7 times more likely to report being asked to verify their tickets or boarding passes after already being seated. She explained, highlighting the relevant data. They were 2.8 times more likely to experience seating errors where their assigned seats were allegedly double-booked. And they were 4.2 times more likely to report feeling unwelcome or out of place due to staff interactions. Richard Bennett, still skeptical, interjected. These could be subjective interpretations of normal operational issues that affect all passengers. Zoe nodded, acknowledging his perspective rather than dismissing it. That's a reasonable point, Mr. Bennett, which is why I've included control comparisons. She advanced to the next slide, which showed similar metrics for white passengers in premium cabins. The disparities were unmistakable. When controlling for all other factors, flight routes, times, aircraft types, crew rotations, these discrepancies remain statistically significant. This isn't about subjective interpretations. It's about consistent patterns that contradict our company values. The CFO, Jeremy Phillips, leaned forward. While these findings are concerning implementing comprehensive reforms, carries significant costs. Have you considered the financial implications I have? Zoe replied, transitioning to a slide titled Cost Analysis Action versus Inaction. This slide shows 3 scenarios: maintaining current practices, implementing partial reforms, or committing to comprehensive change. Her analysis was thorough and practical, factoring in training costs, reporting system development, potential legal liabilities, and most importantly, customer retention impacts. Based on current data, we're losing approximately $14.7 million annually in repeat business from premium passengers who experience these issues. That doesn't include the incalculable reputational damage or potential litigation costs from incidents like what occurred yesterday. The numbers spoke volumes. Even the most finance-focused board members couldn't ignore the cold reality that discrimination wasn't just morally wrong. It was bad for business. Elizabeth Garcia, who had been quietly taking notes, spoke up. Zoe, your analysis is compelling, but I'm curious about implementation. How do we transform culture, not just policies? Zoe smiled slightly. It was exactly the right question. Culture change requires 3 elements: clear expectations, consistent accountability, and visible commitment from leadership. She advanced to a slide showing a 3-phase implementation plan. Phase 1 addresses immediate issues: revised reporting structures that bypass potential conflicts of interest, mandatory training for all customer-facing staff, and a clear passenger bill of rights prominently displayed at gates and in aircraft. Phase 2 focuses on structural improvements: recruitment diversification, promotion, pathway revisions, and an independent review board for passenger complaints. Phase 3 targets long-term cultural transformation: ongoing assessment metrics, incentive alignment with dignity principles, and regular external audits to prevent regression. As Zoe walked through each component, she noticed several board members nodding in agreement. The comprehensiveness of her approach was making an impression. This wasn't just a reaction to one incident, but a thoughtful roadmap for meaningful change. This isn't just about preventing negative experiences, Zoe emphasized. It's about actively creating positive ones. When every passenger feels genuinely welcome, not just technically accommodated, loyalty increases, recommendations rise, and our brand strengthens. She displayed passenger testimonials from airlines with strong dignity initiatives, showing the business benefits of inclusivity. The contrast with Skyway's declining satisfaction scores was stark. Yesterday on Flight 227, I experienced what our data has been trying to tell us, Zoe said, her voice steady but resonant with personal experience. Captain Foster didn't see me as a legitimate first-class passenger. He saw someone who didn't fit his image of who belongs in premium cabins, and he was willing to abuse his authority to enforce that bias. She paused, letting the reality sink in. I was able to stand my ground because of who my father is. But what about the thousands of passengers who don't have that advantage, who endure these indignities silently and simply, choose never to fly with us again? The question hung in the air, challenging each person in the room to consider the human cost behind the statistics. Skyway Airways was founded on the principle that excellence is for everyone. Zoe continued displaying a photo of her father from the airline's early days. Not just those who look a certain way or have certain connections, but everyone who chooses to fly with us. Somewhere along the way, we've drifted from that vision. This initiative is about finding our way back. As Zoe concluded her presentation and returned to her seat, the boardroom was silent. Not with discomfort, but with the weight of recognition. What they had just witnessed wasn't just an extraordinary performance from a 13-year-old, but a clear-eyed assessment of a problem they could no longer ignore. This is an overreaction to an isolated incident, Richard Bennett insisted, his voice carrying across the boardroom. We're talking about millions in implementation costs based on one confrontation that, while unfortunate, doesn't necessarily reflect broader issues. The Financial Committee chairman had been the first to voice opposition after Zoe's presentation concluded. As others nodded in agreement, the momentum that had been building seemed to falter. With respect, Mr. Bennett, Alexander Morales responded, "Our preliminary investigation suggests this is far from isolated. We've already identified 14 formal complaints against Captain Foster alone, all from minority passengers in premium cabins, all dismissed without proper review." Bennett waved this off. 14 complaints over a 23-year career. That's hardly evidence of a widespread problem. Zoe remained silent, observing the dynamics around the table. She had anticipated resistance. Change of this magnitude rarely came without it, but she was also assessing which board members might be persuadable versus those firmly entrenched in opposition. CFO Jeremy Phillips added his concerns. The training costs alone would exceed $3.2 million in the first year. Add system development, external consultants, and productivity impacts during implementation. We're looking at nearly $8 million before seeing any results. And what's the cost of doing nothing? The question came from Elizabeth Garcia, her voice calm but pointed. What's the financial impact of losing premium passengers who experience what Zoe described? What's the potential liability of another incident like yesterday's? But perhaps with someone who files a lawsuit instead of making a presentation. Phillips frowned. Those costs are speculative. Are they? Zoe spoke for the first time since concluding her presentation. All eyes turned to her. On page 18 of my analysis, you'll find the revenue impact of our declining satisfaction scores among minority premium passengers. That's $14.7 million annually in lost repeat business. Not speculative, but directly calculated from our own retention data. She highlighted the relevant section on their tablets. That's nearly double the implementation costs Mr. Phillips just cited, and it happens every year we maintain the status quo. The room fell silent as board members reviewed the figures. Zoe had done her homework meticulously, presenting data that couldn't be easily dismissed. Bennett tried another angle. Even if we accept these numbers, isn't this more about training specific employees rather than overhauling entire systems? Surely we can address problematic individuals without this crusade. Marcus Jackson, who had remained quiet until now, leaned forward. Richard, would you call it a crusade if we discovered that 7% of our aircraft had maintenance issues? Would you suggest fixing only the planes that had actually experienced failures? The analogy resonated with the safety-conscious board members. In aviation, potential problems were addressed proactively, not just after incidents occurred. This isn't about politics or sensitivity, Marcus continued. It's about ensuring consistent excellence for every passenger who chooses Skyway. That was my brother's vision when he founded this airline, and it's a vision worth recommitting to. Another board member, Harold Thompson, representing institutional investors, cleared his throat. I appreciate the sentiment, but my constituents are concerned with quarterly returns, not moral missions. How does this initiative improve shareholder value? Brand integrity drives valuation. Zoe replied without hesitation. When United Airlines dragged a passenger off a flight in 2017, their stock dropped 4% in 24 hours, a $1.4 billion loss in market capitalization. Southwest's commitment to customer experience has historically supported premium valuation multiples compared to competitors. She advanced to a slide comparing airline valuations against customer experience metrics. The correlation is clear. Airlines that consistently deliver positive experiences for all passengers maintain higher PE ratios and greater investor confidence during market fluctuations. Thompson studied the data with newfound interest. Zoe had framed the issue in terms he understood: financial performance and shareholder value, not just moral imperatives. There's another factor we should consider, added Jonathan Harris, one of Skyway's original investors. Thomas Jackson isn't just our founder. He's our majority shareholder. How do you think he'll respond when he learns what happened to his daughter and the pattern it represents? The question hung in the air, its implications clear. Thomas Jackson owned 65% of Skyway Airways. If he decided changes were needed, they would happen regardless of board objections. This isn't about leveraging my father's position. Zoe interjected, her tone firm but not confrontational. This is about doing what's right for our passengers and our business. The data supports it, the financials justify it, and our founding principles demand it. Richard Bennett, sensing the shifting mood in the room, attempted one final objection. Implementation within the proposed timeline seems unrealistic. Training over 12,000 employees while maintaining operations is entirely feasible. Morales interrupted. Samantha Rodriguez from HR has already developed a phased approach that minimizes operational disruption. The question isn't whether we can do this, it's whether we have the will to do it. A silence fell over the boardroom as the opposition's arguments gradually collapsed against the weight of evidence, financial reality, and moral clarity. The resistance hadn't disappeared, but it had lost its momentum. Elizabeth Garcia broke the silence. I move that we put the Passenger Dignity Initiative to a vote. Seconded, said Jonathan Harris. As Alexander Morales called for the vote, Zoe maintained her composed expression. This wasn't about winning a boardroom battle. It was about restoring her father's vision for the airline he had built. One where excellence truly was for everyone. The Passenger Dignity Initiative consists of 4 core components. Zoe began displaying a new slide that outlined her comprehensive proposal. Transparent reporting, accountability structures, enhanced training, and cultural realignment. The board members leaned forward, their earlier resistance giving way to genuine interest, as Zoe detailed each component with the precision of someone twice her age. First, transparent reporting. She highlighted the section on their tablets. We'll implement an anonymous reporting system that bypasses traditional management layers. Complaints concerning discriminatory treatment will be routed directly to an independent review board comprised of customer advocates, ethics officers, and rotating crew members. She clicked to a flowchart showing the proposed system. Currently, complaints funnel through a chain of command where personal relationships can influence outcomes. That's how 14 formal complaints against Captain Foster were buried without executive awareness. Alexander Morales nodded in confirmation. Our preliminary investigation found that these complaints were intercepted by Andrew Wilson, a middle manager with personal connections to Foster. The pattern was consistent and deliberate. The new system prevents such interference. Zoe continued. Every complaint receives a tracking number, and the complainant can follow its progress through resolution. Complete transparency. She advanced to the next component. Second, accountability structures. We'll establish clear consequences for verified incidents of discriminatory behavior, from mandatory retraining for first offenses to termination for repeated or severe cases. Equally important, she emphasized, is recognizing and rewarding staff who exemplify inclusive excellence. Jennifer Collins, the flight attendant who eventually stood up to Captain Foster yesterday, deserves acknowledgement, not just correction of wrongdoing. Several board members nodded in agreement. Positive reinforcement, not just punishment, would be essential for cultural change. Third, enhanced training. Zoe displayed a comprehensive curriculum outline. Every customer-facing employee will complete a dignity-centered service program developed in partnership with diversity experts and our own high-performing crew members. She addressed the CFO directly. Mr. Phillips, you raised valid concerns about training costs. We've structured this program to integrate with existing recertification requirements, reducing additional time commitments by 40% while maintaining effectiveness. Phillips looked impressed despite himself. The young presenter had clearly anticipated his objections and prepared thoughtful responses. Finally, cultural realignment. Zoe's voice took on additional conviction. This is the most challenging component, but also the most essential. Cultural change requires visible commitment from leadership, consistent messaging, and alignment of incentives with our values. She displayed a series of specific actions: executive engagement in training programs, revision of performance metrics to include dignity measures, regular town halls where leadership would hear directly from crew members about challenges and successes. The most powerful tool for cultural change is storytelling, Zoe explained. We'll document and share examples of exceptional service that embody our values, creating visible models of what excellence truly looks like. As she concluded the formal presentation, Zoe took a momentary pause, then spoke more personally. Yesterday on Flight 227, I witnessed both the problem and its potential solution. I saw how deeply ingrained biases can manifest in harmful actions, but I also saw passengers and crew members who recognized those actions as wrong and eventually spoke up. Her voice remained steady, but carried undeniable conviction. This initiative isn't about punishing individuals. It's about creating systems and a culture where dignity isn't dependent on who you are or what you look like, but is the baseline experience for everyone who chooses to fly with Skyway. The boardroom was silent as Zoe's words resonated. Even those who had initially resisted seemed moved by the comprehensive vision she had presented, not just identifying problems, but offering practical, thoughtful solutions. Alexander Morales broke the silence. Thank you, Zoe. Before we move to a vote, are there any final questions for Ms. Jackson? Elizabeth Garcia raised her hand. Implementation timeline. How quickly can we realistically expect to see changes? The reporting system can be developed and deployed within 60 days, Zoe replied confidently. Training programs will roll out in phases over 6 months, beginning with leadership and high customer contact positions. Cultural shifts will take longer. Measurable improvement within a year, substantial transformation within 3. Richard Bennett, who had been the most vocal opponent, asked the final question. And the metrics for success. How will we know if this initiative is achieving its objectives? Multiple indicators, Zoe answered without hesitation. Quantitative measures include elimination of the satisfaction gap between demographic groups, reduction in related complaints, and improved retention of diverse passengers in premium cabins. Qualitative assessment will include regular focus groups, crew feedback, and external audits of our practices. She added, "Most importantly, success means that what happened to me yesterday becomes unimaginable within Skyway Airways, not because of who I am, but because our culture and system simply wouldn't allow it to happen to anyone." The response seemed to satisfy even Bennett, who nodded thoughtfully. Morales surveyed the room. "If there are no further questions, I call for a vote on the proposed Passenger Dignity Initiative." One by one, the board members cast their votes. As the final tally was displayed on screen, unanimous approval, a subtle smile crossed Zoe's face. Not triumphant or self-congratulatory, but the quiet satisfaction of having guided Skyway Airways back toward its founding principles. In that moment, she wasn't just Thomas Jackson's daughter or a 13-year-old who had stood her ground against discrimination. She was a steward of her father's legacy, ensuring that Skyway would truly be an airline where excellence was for everyone. Motion carried unanimously. Alexander Morales announced, his voice carrying a note of both surprise and satisfaction. "The Passenger Dignity Initiative is approved effective immediately." A ripple of conversation spread through the boardroom as members absorbed the significance of their decision. What had begun as a standard quarterly meeting had transformed into a pivotal moment for Skyway Airways, a recommitment to founding principles that had somehow faded over time. Zoe remained composed, accepting congratulatory nods from board members with grace rather than celebration. This wasn't a personal victory, but an organizational correction, bringing the airline back to the vision her father had established. "I'll need authorization to allocate resources for immediate implementation." Morales continued, shifting smoothly to practical matters. "Given the board's approval, I propose establishing a dedicated team reporting directly to me with representatives from operations training, HR, and customer experience." Richard Bennett, who had been the strongest voice of opposition, now leaned forward constructively. "I recommend including legal and compliance as well. We need to ensure all changes align with regulatory requirements and minimize liability during transition." "Agreed," Morales nodded. "And I'd like Samantha Rodriguez to lead the implementation effort. Her background in organizational psychology and experience with our training programs makes her uniquely qualified." As the board discussed operational details, Zoe glanced at her uncle Marcus, who gave her a subtle thumbs up beneath the table. They both knew that the real work, transforming policies into practices, rules into culture, was just beginning. Regarding the incident on Flight 227, Morales addressed the room again. "I've already taken several actions that align with our newly approved initiative." He displayed a list on the main screen. Termination of Captain William Foster, completed suspension, pending investigation of Andrew Wilson and 3 other managers identified in complaint suppression underway. Promotion of Jennifer Collins to Senior Passenger Experience Specialist, effective immediately. 1-year suspension of Victoria Palmer's premium cabin privileges. Processed compensation and formal apology to all passengers on Flight 227 in progress. These immediate actions demonstrate our commitment to accountability. Morales explained. They send a clear message throughout the organization that this initiative isn't just words on paper, but a fundamental shift in how we operate. Jonathan Harris, one of Skyway's original investors, nodded approvingly. The speed and decisiveness of these actions matter as much as the actions themselves. "Well done, Alexander." Elizabeth Garcia turned to Zoe. "Miss Jackson, would you be willing to consult with the implementation team? Your insights would be invaluable, particularly regarding the passenger experience perspective." Zoe considered the request carefully. "I'd be happy to contribute, though I'll need to balance that with my academic responsibilities." A small reminder to the room that despite her poise and articulateness, she was still a 13-year-old with school obligations. Of course, Garcia smiled. Perhaps monthly review meetings would be appropriate. That would work well. Zoe agreed. I'd also recommend involving actual passengers from diverse backgrounds in the process. My experience yesterday was illuminating, but it's only one perspective. Harold Thompson, who had raised shareholder concerns earlier, now seemed fully converted. I'd like to suggest we prepare a special communication to investors, explaining this initiative and its expected impact on long-term value. Framed properly, this could actually strengthen investor confidence. As the discussion continued, Zoe's attention was drawn to a notification on her tablet. A message from Alexander Morales that had been sent privately to her during the meeting. Zoe, your father just called. He's watching the meeting via secure stream. Said to tell you he's never been prouder. We'll connect you after we adjourn. She touched her mother's pearl earring gently, a small gesture of gratitude that went unnoticed by most in the room. Knowing her father had witnessed her presentation and approved meant more than the unanimous board vote. The meeting continued with methodical efficiency, transitioning from approval to implementation planning. Budget allocations were confirmed, timelines established, responsibilities assigned. What had seemed impossible hours earlier, a comprehensive overhaul of how Skyway Airways approached passenger dignity, was now in motion. As the formal meeting concluded and board members began gathering their materials, Richard Bennett approached Zoe directly. Miss Jackson, he said, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine respect. I owe you an apology. I initially dismissed your proposal as an emotional reaction to a personal incident. I was wrong. Zoe met his gaze steadily. Thank you, Mr. Bennett. But what matters isn't who was right or wrong, it's that we're moving forward together. Bennett nodded, seemingly impressed by her maturity. Your father built something remarkable with Skyway, and after today, I believe it's in good hands for the future. As the boardroom gradually emptied, Morales approached with a tablet displaying a video call interface. Your father's waiting to speak with you. Zoe took the tablet, Thomas Jackson's face appearing on screen. Despite his hospital setting, his eyes were bright with pride. Zoe, he said simply, his voice carrying warmth that transcended the digital connection. You did exactly what needed to be done. In that moment, with her father's approval, the board's commitment, and the knowledge that real change was beginning, Zoe felt a sense of completion. Yesterday's confrontation had been painful but necessary, revealing truths that might otherwise have remained hidden beneath comfortable statistics and routine procedures. The Passenger Dignity Initiative wasn't just about preventing another incident like hers. It was about ensuring that every passenger experienced the respect and excellence her father had envisioned when he founded Skyway Airways 2 decades earlier. And now that vision was being renewed, not through his authority but through his daughter's courage and conviction. The numbers speak for themselves, Samantha Rodriguez declared, gesturing to the projection screen in Alexander Morales' office. 6 weeks into implementation, and we're already seeing measurable changes. Zoe studied the data from her seat at the conference table. She had flown back to London specifically for this implementation review, having returned to New York after the board meeting 6 weeks earlier. Her father, fully recovered from his heart attack, had insisted she continue her involvement with the Passenger Dignity Initiative. Complaint resolution times have decreased by 68%. Rodriguez continued. More significantly, we're seeing a 74% increase in reporting of incidents that previously might have gone undocumented. That's actually good news, Zoe observed. It means people trust the new system enough to use it. Morales nodded. Exactly. We can't address problems we don't know exist. Higher reporting rates during early implementation indicate the cultural shift we wanted. Both passengers and crew members feel safe identifying issues. The data displayed other encouraging metrics, a narrowing satisfaction gap between demographic groups. Positive feedback on the new training modules and preliminary retention improvements among previously affected passenger segments. What about resistance? Zoe asked, knowing that organizational change never came without friction. Rodriguez's expression grew more serious. As expected, we've encountered pockets of resistance primarily from longer-tenured employees who were comfortable with the previous systems. About 8% of staff have expressed some form of opposition ranging from passive compliance to active resistance. And how are we addressing that? Morales inquired. Three-tiered approach, Rodriguez explained. Education for those who simply don't understand the purpose, engagement for those with concerns about implementation, and accountability for those who actively undermine the initiative. She displayed a slide showing progress in each category. The education and engagement strategies are working well. We've moved about 60% of initial resistors to active supporters. For the remainder, she paused. We've had to implement progressive discipline in 11 cases with 3 separations. Zoe absorbed this soberly. The goal wasn't punishment, but transformation could sometimes require difficult decisions when individuals refused to align with core values. What about Victoria Palmer? Zoe asked, curious about the passenger who had tried to take her seat. Rodriguez and Morales exchanged glances. She filed a formal appeal against her premium cabin suspension, Rodriguez said. Her husband threatened to pull his company's business with Skyway. And Zoe prompted. We denied the appeal, Morales stated firmly. Her suspension stands. As for Palmer Investments, they've maintained their corporate account with us, but have been notably quiet since our response letter detailing the incident. Zoe nodded, satisfied that principles had prevailed over pressure. And Jennifer Collins? Zoe asked, thinking of the flight attendant who had eventually stood up to Captain Foster. Morales smiled, thriving in her new role. She's become one of our most effective trainers, sharing her experience from Flight 227 as a case study in moral courage and bystander intervention. Her sessions consistently receive the highest evaluation scores. The conversation turned to media coverage, which had been surprisingly positive. After an initial flurry of reports about airline CEO's daughter stands up to discriminatory captain, the narrative had shifted to focus on Skyway's comprehensive response. The Wall Street Journal ran a piece last week praising our initiative as a model for the industry, Morales noted. 3 competitor airlines have reached out about our training modules. And Foster Zoe asked the question quietly. Rodriguez and Morales exchanged glances. He's filed a wrongful termination lawsuit, Rodriguez admitted. But given the multiple recordings and witness statements, our legal team isn't concerned. His FAA certification is under review as well. Zoe nodded, unsurprised. Actions had consequences, and Foster was experiencing his. The most encouraging data point came from the crew surveys. Frontline employees reported feeling more empowered to address problematic behaviors, knowing they had clear backing from leadership. The culture was shifting from one where speaking up carried risks to one where silence was the greater liability. We're making real progress, Morales concluded. Faster than I anticipated, honestly. Your initiative has catalyzed changes that were long overdue. It wasn't just me, Zoe replied. It took everyone in this process, from the passengers who recorded the incident to the board members who approved the changes to the staff implementing them daily. That's how transformation works, not through individual heroes, but through collective commitment. As the meeting concluded, Rodriguez presented Zoe with a small gift box from the implementation team, a token of appreciation. Inside was a custom-designed lapel pin, a small pair of wings with dignity in flight inscribed beneath them. We are distributing these to all crew members who complete the new training program, Rodriguez explained. It's becoming a point of pride. Zoe held the pin, carefully touched by its significance. What had begun as a personal confrontation had evolved into a movement that was changing not just policies, but people's daily experiences, both passengers and employees. Later that evening, as Zoe prepared to board her return flight to New York, she noticed something different at the gate. The Skyway Airways staff wore the new dignity pins prominently. Their interactions with passengers seemed more genuine, less perfunctory. And most tellingly, a young black woman in business attire was escorted to the first-class boarding lane without a second glance or request for additional verification. Small changes, perhaps, but they reflected something profound. An airline remembering its founding vision, recommitting to principles that had been forgotten but not lost. As Zoe took her seat in 2A, the same seat number she had defended on Flight 227, she realized that this journey had come full circle. Not just her physical travel between continents, but the larger journey of transformation that had begun with 5 words from Captain Foster. "This seat isn't for people like you." Those words had revealed a painful truth about Skyway Airways, but they had also created an opportunity for renewal, a chance to ensure that every passenger, regardless of appearance, background, or connections, would experience the dignity they deserved. And as the aircraft lifted into the evening sky, Zoe Jackson touched her mother's pearl earring and smiled. Some battles were worth fighting, not for personal vindication, but for the principles they represented. The principle that every person deserved to be treated with dignity wasn't just a corporate value, it was a human one. And sometimes it took a 13-year-old to remind the adults of what they already knew to be true. Welcome aboard. Skyway Airways Flight 642 to Tokyo. Mr. and Miss Jackson. Thomas Jackson smiled at the gate agent's greeting, placing a gentle hand on Zoe's shoulder as they moved toward the jet bridge. 1 month after the implementation of the Passenger Dignity Initiative, father and daughter were traveling together for the first time since the incident that had sparked transformation throughout the airline. "Looking forward to seeing these changes in action," Thomas commented quietly as they walked. At 58, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had built something significant from nothing. His heart attack had been a warning, not a setback, forcing him to delegate more but strengthening his commitment to the airline's founding principles. "They're not just for show," Zoe assured him. "The quarterly data came in yesterday. Customer satisfaction scores among minority passengers in premium cabins have already improved by 4.3%. The gap is closing." Thomas nodded, pride evident in his expression. "Numbers tell stories if you listen carefully enough." "That's what you always taught me," Zoe replied, smiling at the familiar wisdom. As they boarded the aircraft, Zoe noticed subtle but meaningful differences from her previous flight. Crew members wore the new dignity pins prominently. The welcome announcements included a brief statement about Skyway's commitment to respectful treatment for all passengers. Most importantly, the atmosphere felt different, less hierarchical, more genuinely hospitable. "Mr. Jackson." Miss Jackson, the lead flight attendant, greeted them warmly. "It's an honor to have you on board. Your usual seats are ready. No excessive deference, no fawning, just professional courtesy extended equally to them and the passengers boarding behind them." Thomas noticed this too, nodding approval as they settled into their first-class seats. "You've created something remarkable, Zoe," he said once they were seated. "In just 2 months, you've redirected the course of an entire organization." "I just exposed a problem." Zoe demurred, adjusting her mother's pearl earrings. "Alexander, Samantha, and the implementation team did the hard work." "Don't diminish what you accomplished," Thomas insisted gently. "It takes courage to stand your ground when someone with authority tries to move you. And it takes wisdom to transform a personal confrontation into institutional change." The aircraft filled around them, passengers flowing smoothly into their assigned seats without the friction or tension Zoe had witnessed on Flight 227. In economy, she noticed a flight attendant helping an elderly woman with her luggage with the same attentiveness shown to first-class passengers. Small signs of a culture where dignity wasn't a premium service but a baseline expectation. Thomas opened the quarterly report on his tablet, reviewing the comprehensive data Zoe had referenced. "The training completion rates are impressive. 93% already." "Samantha structured it brilliantly," Zoe explained. Leadership went first, creating accountability for their teams. They also integrated it with required recertification modules, so it didn't feel like an additional burden. As the boarding process concluded, an announcement came over the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Robert Chen speaking. I'd like to welcome you aboard Skyway Airways Flight 642 to Tokyo. We're honored to have our founder, Thomas Jackson, and his daughter Zoe with us today. A ripple of interest moved through the cabin as passengers realized the significance of their fellow travelers. Many of you may have heard about our new Passenger Dignity Initiative, Chen continued. It represents our commitment to ensuring every passenger experiences the respect and excellence they deserve. If there's any way we can improve your journey today, please don't hesitate to let our crew know. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Thomas turned to Zoe. Captain Chen was one of my first pilots, you know. Started with me when we had just 3 aircraft. He was my replacement captain on Flight 227, Zoe revealed, after Foster was removed. Thomas's expression darkened momentarily at the mention of Foster. His lawsuit was dismissed yesterday. Overwhelming evidence of misconduct. I heard Zoe nodded. Victoria Palmer also tried to appeal her premium cabin suspension. Denied. Actions have consequences. Thomas said, simply echoing a lesson he had taught Zoe throughout her life. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted into the sky, father and daughter fell silent, each reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun as a confrontation over a seat had catalyzed a movement that was reshaping an entire airline, bringing it back to the principles upon which it had been founded. In corporate headquarters, Andrew Wilson and 3 other managers had been terminated for their roles in suppressing complaints. Jennifer Collins was thriving in her new role as a senior passenger experience specialist, helping redesign training programs based on real-world scenarios. Most importantly, passengers throughout the Skyway system were beginning to notice differences. Not dramatic changes, but meaningful shifts in how they were treated, welcomed, and valued. Excellence was becoming once again truly for everyone. The Jackson Protocol has been adopted by 4 competitor airlines in the past month alone. Alexander Morales announced standing before the assembled executives in Skyway's quarterly leadership meeting. What began as our internal initiative has become an industry standard for passenger dignity and inclusive excellence. 6 months after Zoe's confrontation with Captain Foster, the ripple effects had expanded far beyond Skyway Airways. The comprehensive approach to ensuring passenger dignity, now formally named the Jackson Protocol in honor of both Thomas and Zoe, had garnered attention throughout the aviation industry and beyond. Thomas Jackson, seated at the head of the conference table, nodded appreciatively. Numbers Samantha Rodriguez stepped forward with the data presentation. Customer satisfaction scores have equalized across all demographic categories in premium cabins. The 7% gap has been eliminated. Overall satisfaction is up 5.2% system-wide, with the most significant improvements among minority passengers. She advanced to the next slide. Retention rates have improved 12% among previously affected segments. The financial impact is clear. An estimated $23.4 million in preserved revenue that would have been lost to competitors under our previous conditions. The CFO, Jeremy Phillips, once skeptical about the initiative's costs, now leaned forward with interest. ROI has exceeded projections by 27%. Implementation costs were fully recovered within 4 months, with ongoing positive impact on quarterly earnings. Thomas glanced at Zoe, seated quietly beside him, pride evident in his expression. What she had initiated wasn't just morally right. It was proving to be sound business practice as well. Beyond the numbers, Rodriguez continued, we're seeing profound cultural shifts. Crew surveys show 91% now feel empowered to address problematic behaviors immediately, compared to 34% before implementation. Incident reporting is up, but actual incidents are down, meaning issues are being identified and addressed before escalating. The presentation continued with additional metrics and case studies, all pointing to a fundamental transformation in how Skyway Airways operated. But the most compelling evidence came from outside the company. Former employees who left due to the previous culture have begun returning, Morales noted. 23 experienced crew members have rejoined Skyway in the past quarter, citing the Jackson Protocol as their primary motivation. Among them was Sebastian Thompson, a black pilot who had left 3 years earlier after his complaints about Foster's hostile behavior were dismissed. Now he was back as a training captain, helping other pilots understand how their actions affected passenger experience. We're also seeing impacts beyond aviation, Rodriguez added. Hotel chains, cruise lines, and rail services have reached out to learn from our model. The core principles of dignity, accountability, and inclusive excellence translate across industries. As the meeting concluded, executives filed out with a sense of accomplishment that transcended typical corporate success. This wasn't just about improved metrics or industry recognition. It was about fundamental human values being reaffirmed and embedded in daily operations. Thomas lingered, waiting until he and Zoe were alone in the conference room. I built this airline 20 years ago because I believed excellence shouldn't be determined by appearance or background, he said quietly. Somewhere along the way, parts of the organization drifted from that vision. And now they've found their way back. Zoe completed the thought. Thomas nodded. Because of you. Because you refused to move when someone decided you didn't belong. I had good teachers, Zoe replied, touching her mother's pearl earring. The same gesture Jasmine had made when standing her ground in hospital boardrooms, where her presence as a black female chief surgeon had been questioned. Outside the conference room, the daily operations of Skyway Airways continued. Flights departed, passengers were welcomed, journeys facilitated. But beneath these routine activities, something fundamental had shifted. The airline Thomas Jackson had built was once again becoming the airline he had envisioned, where dignity wasn't a slogan, but a lived reality. Former employees weren't the only ones noticing. Applications for crew positions had increased 43% since the Jackson Protocol's implementation, with many candidates specifically citing the company's values as their motivation. Industry publications had featured Skyway's transformation in cover stories. Competitors were scrambling to adopt similar approaches, recognizing that treating passengers with consistent dignity wasn't just ethical, it was good business. And at the center of this transformation was a 13-year-old girl who had simply refused to give up her rightful seat, not out of stubbornness or entitlement, but out of a deep understanding that dignity wasn't negotiable. As Thomas and Zoe walked through the operations center, staff members acknowledged them with respectful nods. Not the nervous deference once shown to the founder and his daughter, but the genuine respect accorded to leaders who had earned it through actions that matched their words. "Your mother would be so proud," Thomas said softly as they reached the elevator. "I know," Zoe replied, her quiet confidence reflecting both parents' influence, her father's vision, and her mother's unwavering dignity. "She is. Your boarding pass, Miss Jackson." 1 year to the day after the confrontation on Flight 227, Zoe stood at a Skyway Airways gate at JFK International Airport. She wore a different blazer now, navy blue instead of burgundy, but the same pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother. The gate agent scanned her pass and smiled warmly. "Seat 2A is ready for you. Have a wonderful flight to London." No questions about her age, no suspicious glances. No implicit suggestion that she didn't belong in first class. Just professional courtesy extended equally to every passenger regardless of appearance. As Zoe walked down the jet bridge, she reflected on how much had changed in a single year. The Jackson Protocol had transformed Skyway Airways from within, establishing new systems and standards that ensured dignity for all passengers. But more importantly, it had changed the daily experiences of thousands of people who might never know the catalyst for that transformation. Boarding the aircraft, Zoe was greeted by a young flight attendant whose name tag read, Sophia Martinez. "Welcome aboard, Miss Jackson," Sophia said, gesturing toward the first-class cabin. "May I show you to your seat? I know where it is." "Thank you," Zoe replied with a small smile. 2A. As she settled into the now familiar leather seat, Zoe noticed the dignity pin on Sophia's uniform, the small wings with dignity in flight inscribed beneath them. What had begun as a symbol for the implementation team had become standard for all Skyway crew members, worn with genuine pride. The first-class cabin filled around her, business executives typing last-minute emails, tourists excited for London adventures, a famous musician with subtle designer headphones. The diversity was notable, not just in appearance, but in style, age, and demeanor. First class was no longer a homogeneous space, but reflected the varied tapestry of travelers Skyway served. Captain Elena Rivera's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Skyway Airways Flight 227 to London Heathrow. We're particularly honored today to have with us Zoe Jackson, whose courage exactly 1 year ago helped Skyway recommit to our founding principle, that excellence is for everyone." A ripple of recognition moved through the cabin. Some passengers glanced at Zoe with newfound understanding. Others nodded respectfully. A few who had read about the incident smiled in appreciation. Sophia approached with a glass of orange juice. "Before takeoff, Miss Jackson." "Thank you." Zoe accepted the drink. "And please, just call me Zoe." "Of course." Sophia hesitated, then added quietly, "I joined Skyway because of the Jackson Protocol. I used to work for a competitor where, well, let's just say, dignity wasn't always the priority. What you started has changed things for crew members too, not just passengers." The simple acknowledgement carried more weight than elaborate praise. Real change wasn't measured in policies or press releases, but in daily experiences. In Sophia, finding a workplace where she could serve with pride in passengers feeling genuinely welcome, regardless of appearance, in crew members being empowered to uphold values rather than just follow procedures. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man settled into his seat. Noticing Zoe, he smiled politely. "Excuse me, but aren't you the one who started the Dignity Initiative?" "I was involved," Zoe acknowledged modestly. "My daughter works for United Airlines now, but she started with Skyway," he explained. "She tells me they've adopted your protocol too. It's making a real difference in how they operate." Zoe had heard similar stories throughout the year. Continental Airways, Pacific Star, and Emirates One had all implemented versions of the Jackson Protocol, adapting its principles to their own operations. What began as one airline's internal reform had evolved into an industry-wide movement. Industry publications had taken notice too. Last month's Aviation Business Review featured Skyway on its cover with the headline, "The Dignity Revolution: How One Airline Transformed Passenger Experience." The article detailed how Skyway's customer satisfaction scores had reached record highs, with particular improvement among previously marginalized passenger groups. But the most meaningful changes weren't in magazine articles or industry awards. They were in the small daily interactions that defined the passenger experience. A flight attendant's genuine smile, a gate agent's respectful assistance, a captain's welcoming announcement that made everyone feel valued. And there were broader impacts too. When Victoria Palmer's 1-year suspension ended last week, she had written a surprising letter to Skyway's customer service department, acknowledging her behavior and expressing appreciation for the lesson learned. "I understand now that privilege isn't an entitlement to special treatment," she wrote. "True dignity comes from respecting the dignity of others." Even William Foster, after his wrongful termination lawsuit was dismissed, had undergone a period of reflection. His recent application to serve as a volunteer mentor with an aviation program for disadvantaged youth suggested he might be finding his way toward redemption. As for Andrew Wilson and the other managers who had systematically buried complaints, they faced more complicated paths. Some had left aviation entirely. Others had accepted responsibility and sought opportunities to make amends. The Jackson Protocol's emphasis on accountability with opportunities for growth meant that even those who had failed could find ways to contribute positively if they were willing to change. As Flight 227 prepared for takeoff, Zoe checked her messages one last time. A text from her father appeared on screen. 1 year later. You stood your ground and changed an entire industry. Your mother would be so proud. I know I am. Zoe touched her mother's pearl earring gently, feeling the connection to her mother's legacy of quiet strength and unwavering dignity. Dr. Jasmine Jackson had taught her daughter that respect wasn't earned through appearance or status, but was the baseline everyone deserved. That lesson, applied in a first-class cabin when a captain had decided she didn't belong, had transformed not just an airline but an industry. Would you like to see the latest satisfaction scores? Sophia asked, noticing Zoe's reflective expression as she returned to collect her empty glass. They were just released to staff this morning. Pretty remarkable. I'd like that, Zoe replied. Sophia showed her a tablet displaying the quarterly report. The 7% satisfaction gap that had first alerted Zoe to the problem had not only closed but reversed. Minority passengers now reported slightly higher satisfaction than the average, suggesting Skyway had truly embraced inclusive excellence. It's not just about the numbers, though, Sophia added. It's how different it feels to work here now. There's this sense that we're all part of something important, that how we treat people truly matters. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway, Zoe felt a sense of completion that transcended her initial goal. When she had refused to give up seat 2A a year ago, she'd been defending her own dignity. But that stand had evolved into something far greater, a movement that protected the dignity of countless others who would never have to defend their seats or justify their presence. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the clear morning sky, banking gently toward the Atlantic. As the New York skyline receded below, Zoe reflected on her mother's words from years ago. Sometimes the most important battles aren't the loud public ones, but the quiet daily insistences on dignity. The real victory wasn't just in the policies changed or the systems reformed. It was in creating a world where a 13-year-old girl could sit in seat 2A without anyone questioning whether she belonged there, where excellence truly was for everyone, not just those who looked a certain way or had certain connections. And as Flight 227 soared toward London, Zoe Jackson smiled at the realization that sometimes the most powerful words weren't grand speeches or elaborate policies, but the simple, unwavering response to those who would deny your dignity. This seat is mine. I'm not asking, I'm stating a fact. If you enjoyed this powerful story, please consider liking this video and sharing it with friends and family who might find it meaningful. Stories like these remind us that standing up for dignity and respect can create real change, even when faced with intimidating opposition. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring narratives that showcase courage, integrity, and transformation in everyday moments. Your support helps us continue to produce content that matters. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or similar experiences. We'd love to hear how this story resonated with you.